Imagine a world before the idea of forgiveness was ever spoken, before the soft word of reconciliation existed, before any hand was extended not to strike but to soothe. Picture a time when the very notion of letting go of an injury would have felt alien, unthinkable, perhaps even dangerous. This was the world of our earliest ancestors, a world in which every glance, every act, every insult carried weight that could not be dissolved. The landscapes they walked were vast, primal, and filled with life beyond measure, but their social landscapes were harsher still. In this world, survival was tethered to memory. To forget an injury was to invite another. To forgive was to risk repeating pain. And so, early humans lived in a state of perpetual vigilance, their minds sharpened by the memory of every wound. They remembered who took food from them, who struck them, who betrayed trust at the hunt or stole a place by the fire. They carried these memories like stones in a pouch, heavy but necessary. Grudges were not just emotions, they were tools of survival. The natural order reinforced this. Among predators and prey, there was no such thing as forgiveness. The lion did not forgive the hyena that stole its kill. The wolf did not forgive the rival that threatened its place. The universe itself seemed to declare, every action must be answered in kind, every harm must leave its echo. It was in this atmosphere of retribution that humanity was shaped. We must pause to imagine how it felt. For us, forgiveness is an invisible constant, woven into our families, our friendships, our very concept of justice. But strip it away, and the world changes color. In a world without forgiveness, every wrong becomes permanent. Each offense builds upon the last, stacking like stones in an endless wall between people. The result is a society in which grudges calcify, where vengeance is not choice but obligation. Archaeology gives us haunting glimpses into this unforgiving world. Skulls cracked by blunt weapons, bones marked by healed fractures that suggest repeated violence, evidence of massacres preserved in the soil. We see groups ambushed, bodies discarded, lives cut short by feud and reprisal. These were not rare events. They were woven into the rhythm of existence. Violence was remembered, and memory demanded action. If one clan struck another, retaliation would follow, perhaps not tomorrow, but someday, inevitably. To modern eyes this seems brutal, even hopeless. But for our ancestors, this cycle was logical. It was the only law they knew, the law of balance. If harm was done, harm must be returned. Only then could order be restored. Forgiveness, had it been suggested, would have sounded like weakness. To forgive was to appear defenseless, to invite humiliation, to lower one's standing in a community where reputation was as vital as water or fire. In this way, vengeance was not merely instinct but social necessity. And yet, there is something deeply human in even this harsh order. To demand vengeance is to say, I remember you. Your actions matter. A wrong was not forgotten because, in a world without written records or formal laws, memory itself was justice. The scar on a man's arm was his court document. The story whispered around a fire about betrayal was his tribe's archive. Forgiveness had not yet been invented, but meaning was already inscribed in the wounds and words that passed from generation to generation. What is remarkable is that, in this unforgiving landscape, humans still endured. They built alliances, formed families, and created fragile threads of trust despite the risks. Perhaps in those small bonds of cooperation, fragile as a spider's web, we see the earliest shadows of what forgiveness might one day become. For even in a world ruled by vengeance, there were moments of hesitation, moments where retaliation was delayed, where conflict was resolved not with weapons but with uneasy silence. Picture an early human band gathered around a fire. The embers glow, the night is thick with sounds of predators, and the air smells of smoke and ash. Two hunters have quarreled. One accused the other of stealing meat. Voices rise, fists might fly, and the memory of betrayal is etched into everyone present. But then, an elder steps between them. The elder does not forgive, nor does he ask for forgiveness. Instead, he demands balance. Perhaps the accused must bring extra food tomorrow, perhaps he must sacrifice his share for a night. This is not forgiveness as we know it, but it is a substitution, a ritual exchange meant to cool the fire of vengeance without extinguishing it. Yet, for now, the dominant reality is clear. There is no release, no letting go, no freedom from the past. Every wrong lives on until it is answered. The emotional burden of such a world is staggering to imagine. Anger becomes inheritance, feuds stretch across generations, and children are born into conflicts older than themselves. To be human in such a world was to live under the weight of unbroken memory. And still, somewhere deep in this relentless cycle, the possibility of change was waiting. Perhaps it flickered in the maternal instinct to soothe a crying child rather than punish. Perhaps it lived in the bond between friends who, despite quarrels, chose to hunt together the next day. Perhaps it appeared in the silence after violence, when exhaustion overcame rage and people sat staring at the fire, wondering if there might be another way. This is where our story begins. In a world without forgiveness, a world in which every cut, every theft, every betrayal left scars that could not be washed away. And yet, within that bleakness lay the seed of something revolutionary. Forgiveness had not yet been invented, but the need for it, the aching hunger for release from endless vengeance, was already growing. The human heart, though hardened by necessity, was quietly preparing for one of its most profound inventions, the ability to let go. Fire was humanity's first miracle, and its first curse. It was warmth in the bitter cold, light in the endless night, safety from predators that prowled in the dark. To gather around a flame was to gather around life itself. Yet fire was also temptation. It could be stolen, hoarded, or denied. For every tribe that discovered its power, another might look upon those glowing embers with envy. And where envy lived, resentment followed. Imagine a circle of early humans, their faces painted with flickering orange, eyes wide with awe at the flames. This was no ordinary resource. Unlike a spear or a hide, fire could not be carried in one's hands. It demanded constant tending, and it belonged not to one person, but to all. A careless ember shared could save a neighboring family, but a stolen torch could doom the tribe who kept it. Fire was communal, and yet it sparked the very first questions of ownership. Whose fire is it? Who deserves its warmth? It is here, in these primal negotiations, that humanity may have experienced its first deep quarrels. Archaeologists cannot show us the first grudge born beside a flame, but the logic is easy to reconstruct. One night, perhaps, a young man took fire from another group without asking. His theft was survival to him, but insult to the tribe he stole from. The wrong could not be ignored. An ember stolen in the dark might be answered with a stone in the skull. Thus, fire not only lit the night, it illuminated the fragility of human trust. For with fire came a new kind of vulnerability. To lose a flame was not like losing food that could be hunted again. To lose fire was to slip back into the terror of darkness, the cold that gnawed bone deep, the sound of wolves circling unseen. The theft of fire was not just a slight, it was existential. It was betrayal at the deepest level, one that branded memory like a burn on the skin. And so, fire became the theater of our earliest grudges. It united and divided in equal measure. The same embers that allowed tribes to cook food, to share warmth, to sit together in the intimacy of light also cast shadows where suspicion grew. Who fed the flames? Who let them burn too low? Who brought wetwood that smoked the camp and stung the eyes? Each act was remembered, and in remembering, the first grudges smoldered like coals. But these grudges were not trivial. They were survival politics. To be seen as careless with fire, or worse, as selfish, was to risk expulsion from the circle. And to be outside the circle was death. Thus, resentment over fire was both practical and deeply emotional. A man denied fire was denied belonging. A family blamed for negligence might carry that stigma for years. We may never know their words, but we can imagine the tone, anger sharp like sparks, accusations thrown like dry branches into an already blazing argument. What made fire unique was that it was both eternal and fragile. It could last indefinitely if tended, and yet die within minutes if neglected. This mirrored the fragile bonds of early human communities. One careless act, one betrayal, and the light went out. In such a context, the concept of forgiveness was almost inconceivable. Who could risk forgiving when the very survival of the group was tied to vigilance? A single failure to punish theft or neglect could doom an entire camp. Forgiveness was a risk they could not afford. Consider the symbolism. Fire both nourished and destroyed. It cooked food and hardened weapons, but it also burned shelters and scarred flesh. It was both gift and threat. To possess fire was to possess power, and power always breeds resentment. Rival clans would have coveted each other's flames, watching with longing eyes from the darkness, knowing that one bold theft could change their fortune overnight. And so, the first feuds may well have been born over embers, small in appearance, infinite in consequence. These feuds were not quickly resolved. A family wronged over fire would not forget. Even if the blaze was relit, the memory of theft would fester. Each spark of conflict could spread like wildfire into larger disputes, over food, over territory, over dignity. Fire had lit more than the night. It had ignited the first long-burning grudges, the kind that endured beyond a single quarrel, passed from parent to child as warnings never to trust too easily again. Yet there is something profoundly poetic in this. Fire, the first symbol of community, was also the first mirror of human fragility. It revealed that survival was not just about tools or weapons, but about trust. That trust was brittle, easily broken, and grudges were the ash left behind when it failed. But even in this harsh beginning, there was a paradox. For as much as fire divided, it also demanded cooperation. One person alone could not keep a flame alive through storms and nights. Only together could the fire be protected. And so, though grudges burned hot, they did not always consume the circle entirely. Somewhere in those heated arguments, humans were learning to negotiate the tension between resentment and cooperation. It is in this paradox that we glimpse the faint silhouette of forgiveness on the horizon. Forgiveness had not yet been born, but the stage was being set. Fire forced humans to balance survival with memory, to weigh anger against necessity. If the tribe punished every slight without restraint, the circle would fracture and the flame would die. If they ignored every insult, trust would collapse and theft would spread. Between vengeance and blindness, there had to emerge something else. And so, by the light of the first fire, humanity learned its first grudges. They were fierce, unforgiving, carved deep into memory. Yet within those grudges flickered the earliest fragile possibility of another path, a path not yet taken, but waiting, like an ember glowing at the heart of the flame. The earth remembers what people forget. Buried beneath layers of soil and time, bones lie silent, yet they whisper stories of conflict, of survival, of wounds that were never healed. Archaeologists, with patient hands and careful tools, lift these bones from the ground, and in the scars etched upon them we glimpse the echoes of a world before forgiveness. A skull cracked by a blunt weapon, a femur shattered, healed crooked, the mark of violence carried to the grave. Ribs pierced by stone-tipped arrows, pelvises scarred by blows that never fully mended. These are not the traces of accidents alone. They are records of human beings striking human beings. They are the remnants of grudges so fierce that they shaped bodies as much as they shaped memory. Imagine the scene, a small band of hunter-gatherers moving across a plain. One man carries the memory of a stolen kill, another the insult of being denied fire. Tension simmers until, one evening, violence erupts. Stones fly, spears thrust, and blood stains the grass. When the fight is over, one or more lie dead, and their bones, tossed aside or hastily buried, carry the testimony of what words cannot. Thousands of years later, when unearthed, those bones still speak. They say, here was a life cut short by vengeance. What makes these remains haunting is not simply the violence, but its persistence. Many skeletons show repeated injuries, fractures that healed only to be broken again. These are not isolated outbursts, they tell us of a culture of retaliation, of grudges kept alive long after the initial wound. If a man's arm was broken in one fight, healed, and broken again years later, it means the cycle of hostility endured. Bones become chronicles of feuds, their fractures like entries in a ledger of violence. And yet, these people lived. They carried their injuries, limping, scarred, altered, but unbroken. In their bodies we see both the harshness of their world and their resilience within it. A skull bearing the mark of a heavy strike that healed tells us not only that someone struck, but also that someone cared enough to feed and tend the wounded until he recovered. Here lies the paradox of humanity before forgiveness. Violence was constant, but so too was care. Resentment lived beside compassion, revenge beside tenderness. Bones record both stories. Archaeologists sometimes uncover entire burial sites filled with victims of massacres. Dozens of skeletons, men, women, and children, killed in sudden raids. Spears embedded in ribs, skulls smashed beyond repair. These grim tableaus reveal more than isolated anger, they reveal the scale of grudges that spilled beyond individuals into whole tribes. Retaliation was not just personal, but collective. If one man wronged another, the feud could engulf families, clans, even generations. The soil that covers these skeletons is thick with time, but beneath it lies a history of grievance carried forward like an inheritance. What is striking is how much energy humanity poured into remembering these wrongs. Oral stories, retold by firelight, carried tales of betrayal, treachery, and dishonor across lifetimes. And bones gave physical evidence to these stories, permanent reminders of the cost of vengeance. In this sense, the dead were not only mourned, they were remembered as symbols of grudges yet unresolved. A broken skull was not simply a tragedy, it was a reason to act, a debt to be repaid. The bones of the fallen became monuments, even if unmarked, inspiring retaliation that stretched far into the future. We can imagine how these memories haunted the living. A child might see the scar on his father's head and be told the story of how it was given. He might see the limp in his uncle's step and hear how it was inflicted by another clan. In this way, bones walked among the living, embodied in wounds and scars. Forgiveness was not simply absent, it was almost impossible, because memory was carved into flesh. To forgive would mean to ignore what was plain to see every day. And yet, the bones whisper another story as well, of endurance, of healing that took place in spite of vengeance. Healed fractures prove that even in societies without hospitals, without anesthesia, people nursed each other back to life. Someone gave food to the injured hunter who could not walk. Someone kept watch over the wounded while predators prowled. These acts suggest that not every wrong led to permanent rupture. Not every grudge ended in blood. Survival demanded both conflict and cooperation. And within that tension, the earliest cracks of forgiveness might have begun to appear, not as lofty ideals, but as pragmatic choices. Still, when we look at these bones today, what strikes us most is the weight of history they carry. They are evidence of a humanity that had not yet learned how to lay down its grudges, a world in which every injury lingered, every betrayal left a scar not only on the heart but on the skeleton. The ground itself is heavy with resentment, holding within it the physical proof that vengeance was once the law of existence. Consider, for a moment, what it must have felt like to live surrounded by such reminders. Every limp, every scar, every disfigured limb was a story, a warning, a memory demanding justice. There were no clean slates, no erasures. In a sense, the body was the archive of grievance, and the tribe its reader. Life was written in wounds, and wounds demanded reply. And yet, even here, we glimpse the faint outline of change. For if bones can heal, perhaps hearts can too. If a man with a cracked skull can live on, fed and protected by his companions, then maybe forgiveness, though unnamed, unimagined, was already stirring beneath the surface. Not yet a word, not yet a principle, but a possibility. A possibility waiting, like the bones themselves, to be uncovered by time. In this way, the skeletons we study are more than relics, they are mirrors, showing us a humanity both fierce and fragile, trapped in cycles of vengeance but yearning, perhaps unknowingly, for release. They remind us that forgiveness did not appear suddenly, as if from nowhere. It emerged from this soil of scars, this long history of injury and retaliation. The bones that remember are also the bones that prepared the way for something beyond vengeance, something that would one day be called forgiveness. Before there were kings or courts, before written law or carved tablets, there was vengeance. It was humanity's first law, older than civilization, older even than the stories that carried its weight. Where today we might speak of justice, balance, or forgiveness, in the beginning there was only retaliation. To harm was to be harmed in return. To spill blood was to invite blood. This law was not written in symbols or decrees, it was written in memory. In the minds of early humans, vengeance was a map that guided behavior, ensuring that no injury went unanswered. It was not optional, not negotiable. To refuse vengeance was to betray your kin, to dishonor your ancestors, to weaken your people standing in the eyes of rivals. The law of vengeance was as natural to them as breathing. We must pause to imagine its weight. In the fragile bands and tribes of prehistory, each person was more than an individual. Each was part of a web of kinship and alliance, and the web was fragile. If one strand broke, the whole could unravel. When an insult or injury occurred, it was not simply a matter between two people, it was an attack on the entire group. And the group demanded repayment. Archaeological evidence and anthropological studies of later tribal societies reveal how deep this law ran. Feuds did not die with the first blow, they grew, spreading like fire in dry grass, leaping from one generation to the next. A man killed in one clan might lead his sons to take revenge, which in turn demanded retaliation from the other side. Thus, vengeance became an inheritance, passed down like land, tools, or sacred stories. Entire lineages lived beneath its shadow. To modern eyes, vengeance seems destructive, even senseless. But to our ancestors, it was order. In a world without courts or police, vengeance ensured accountability. It created boundaries of behavior. If you strike, you will be struck. If you steal, you will be punished. It deterred as much as it destroyed. It was brutal, yes, but it was also structure, a form of justice born from necessity. Imagine two small groups meeting on a riverbank. Perhaps one has accused the other of stealing food or of insulting an elder. Voices rise, weapons are drawn, and blood is spilled. For us, The fight ends when one side lies defeated. But for them, the fight is only the beginning. The memory of that blood will ripple outward, touching every relative, every ally, every future encounter. The wound is not just in the flesh, it is in the law of vengeance, and until it is repaid, it remains open. This cycle explains much of the violence recorded in ancient remains. It was not always random savagery, as we might imagine, but carefully observed ritual. One life for another, one injury for another. In some societies, even the method of vengeance was symbolic. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The symmetry was deliberate, a way of restoring balance through mirrored harm. The world itself seemed to affirm this law. Nature had its own cycles of retribution. Storms followed droughts, predators struck when prey weakened, death followed birth. For early humans, the idea that harm should be answered by harm was not philosophy, it was reality. They saw vengeance as an echo of the natural order. And yet, beneath its order lay chaos. Vengeance spiraled easily beyond control. A quarrel between two hunters could grow into decades-long bloodshed between families. A theft of food might escalate into massacres. Anthropologists studying tribal societies, even in recent centuries, have documented feuds stretching so far back that the original offense is forgotten, yet the obligation to retaliate persists. Vengeance, once set in motion, rarely rests. This burden weighed heavily on individuals. A son might be expected to avenge his father, even if years had passed, even if he felt no personal anger. To refuse was shameful, even dangerous. The tribe might cast him out as weak, untrustworthy, or dishonorable. Thus, vengeance was not only an act, it was a duty, a performance of loyalty that proved one's place in the group. In a sense, vengeance was social glue, binding people together through shared obligations, even as it tore them apart through violence. Consider the emotional landscape this created. Every gesture could be read as insult. Every misstep risked retaliation. Suspicion was constant, trust fragile. Friendships across clans were perilous, for one day loyalty might demand that you harm the very person you once hunted beside. Children grew up with stories of old wrongs, taught to remember the names of enemies as carefully as they remembered the names of kin. Memory itself became a weapon, and to forget a grudge was nearly unthinkable. And yet, vengeance was not always blind chaos. It had its rituals, its codes. Some societies required formal declarations before revenge could be taken. Others allowed negotiation of compensation, livestock, tools, or women given in marriage to settle a score. These practices hint at the slow evolution toward forgiveness, though in this stage, it was not forgiveness at all, but transaction. Still, the very idea that vengeance could be tempered showed that humans were already grappling with the heavy cost of endless bloodshed. The burden of vengeance shaped not only individuals, but whole cultures. Myths and legends of gods and heroes often revolve around cycles of revenge, reflecting the central place it held in human life. From the earliest oral traditions, we see divine figures punishing insult, striking back at betrayal, answering injury with injury. The gods mirrored humanity, and humanity mirrored the gods. Together they wove vengeance into the fabric of meaning itself. But for all its power, vengeance carried within it the seed of its own undoing. The more it was obeyed, the more destructive it became. Feuds drained resources, left tribes weakened, exposed them to external threats. While vengeance created order, it also made communities fragile. A single wrong could spiral into ruin. Slowly, painfully, humans began to feel the cost of their first law. Imagine the exhaustion of living in such a world. Every loss of a loved one demanded response. Every injury carried a weight of obligation. No one could rest, because no conflict was ever truly ended. A man's death was not just grief, it was a call to action, binding his kin to strike again. Women mourned not only the loss of husbands and sons, but the knowledge that the cycle of vengeance would claim others in turn. Even joy was shadowed by the memory of feuds waiting to be reignited. And yet, within this exhaustion, change stirred. The law of vengeance could not be abolished overnight, it was too deeply rooted in survival. But slowly, cracks appeared. Some groups experimented with mediation, with ritual settlements, with ways to satisfy the law without endless killing. These early experiments were not forgiveness, but they were its ancestors. They hinted at the revolutionary possibility that a wrong could be acknowledged without demanding equal harm in return. Still, for countless generations, vengeance remained the dominant force. It was humanity's first law, carved into memory, passed down through stories, written into bones. To live was to remember was to repay, and to repay was to survive. Forgiveness was unimaginable, a concept not yet born. And yet, deep beneath the cycles of violence, the ground was already being prepared. For if vengeance was the first law, it was only natural that one day humanity would invent a second. Amid the cycles of vengeance, amid the weight of feuds and the sharpness of memory, there were softer moments, moments that did not fit the law of retaliation. These moments were born not in the clash of spears, but in the quiet of the cradle, in the arms of mothers, in the fragile bonds between children and those who cared for them. If vengeance was humanity's first law, then mercy was its first rebellion. And it began, perhaps, in the intimacy of family. Picture a mother holding her infant near the fire. The night is cold, the camp uneasy after a quarrel between hunters. The tribe is tense, the memory of insult still fresh. But in the warmth of her arms, the child does not know vengeance, does not know grievance. He knows only hunger, only the comfort of milk, only the rhythm of a lullaby hummed against his ear. In this fragile space, something radical is happening. The act of love is overriding the logic of retaliation. Here, mercy takes its first breath. Children, too, were reminders that not everything could be reduced to cycles of injury and repayment. Their clumsiness, their mistakes, their constant testing of boundaries created countless opportunities for irritation, even anger. And yet, again and again, parents chose patience over punishment. A child who stumbled into the fire was not struck for carelessness, but pulled away, soothed, taught gently. A boy who wasted food was scolded, perhaps, but not treated as an enemy. In these small choices lay the earliest glimpses of forgiveness, not as philosophy, but as instinct. Why did this happen? Because family was the one bond that could not be dissolved by vengeance alone. A tribe might feud with another, but a mother could not truly feud with her child. Blood demanded patience where law demanded retaliation. To strike back at every insult, every frustration, would mean destroying the very bonds that sustained life. So parents learned a different response: to release anger, to endure mistakes, to begin again. In that endurance, forgiveness was seeded. The tenderness of caregiving extended beyond mothers. Among hunter-gatherers, children were often raised communally, watched over by siblings, grandparents, and even unrelated adults. This shared responsibility created webs of compassion where tolerance was not just emotional, but practical. To nurse another's child, to calm a crying infant that was not your own, was to practice a form of mercy. These acts did not erase the cycles of vengeance outside the camp, but they softened life within it. Imagine two brothers fighting over food, their shouts threatening to wake the sleeping camp. Their mother intervenes, not with blows, but with stern words, a dividing of portions, perhaps even a quiet embrace that assures them both they are loved. In that moment, the quarrel is disarmed not through vengeance, but through reconciliation. The balance is restored not by striking back, but by stepping down. Though no one names it, forgiveness has just taken its first tentative form. It is in these small domestic choices that humanity began to learn another law, one that ran counter to vengeance. Mercy within the family created a model that could one day expand beyond it. If a mother could forgive her child's mistakes, perhaps a tribe could learn to forgive the errors of its members. If siblings could quarrel and reconcile, perhaps clans could one day do the same. The family was not just a unit of survival, it was a school of mercy. Of course, mercy was not universal. Parents also struck their children, siblings fought bitterly, families fractured under the weight of anger. But even here, something subtle was changing. Unlike vengeance between rival groups, which demanded escalation, conflict within families often demanded resolution. Life was too intertwined, too dependent on cooperation, to allow grudges to grow endlessly. In the space of family, forgiveness was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Anthropologists studying early societies often note that caregiving behaviors extend even beyond kinship. Adoption of orphans, care for the sick, feeding of the elderly, these acts of mercy were surprisingly common. They reveal that humanity was capable of stepping outside the cold law of vengeance, at least sometimes, to practice something gentler. These gestures may not have been called forgiveness, but they carried the same essence: to preserve relationship instead of severing it, to choose compassion over retaliation. We might even say that forgiveness was not first invented in councils of warriors or decrees of chiefs. It was invented in whispers, in lullabies, in the tender patience of those who chose love over anger. Long before shamans declared rituals of cleansing, mothers were already forgiving their children's mistakes in silence. And long before tribes negotiated peace treaties, siblings had already learned to quarrel and then return to play. This is not to romanticize prehistory. families knew cruelty as well as care, and mercy could be fleeting in the face of hunger and danger. But even in this harsh context, moments of grace existed. And in these moments, the seeds of forgiveness took root, seeds that, though fragile, would one day grow into the vast tree of human reconciliation. It is striking to imagine, while vengeance was loud, visible, and dramatic, mercy was quiet, invisible, almost secret. Vengeance left bones cracked and graves filled, while mercy left no archaeological trace. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The very survival of humanity suggests that mercy must have existed alongside violence, or else the weight of vengeance would have destroyed us. Thus, when we search for the origin of forgiveness, we must look not only at rituals of law and punishment, but at the tender spaces of family. For it was there, in the hush of night, in the embrace of mother and child, in the resilience of siblings who chose to play again after a fight, that forgiveness began its long journey. The world was still ruled by vengeance, but within the circle of family, a different law was already stirring, a law not of retaliation, but of mercy. Vengeance is intoxicating. It promises justice, balance, and honor. But left unchecked, it becomes a fire that consumes more than it restores. To live in a world ruled by retaliation is to live in a cycle that never ends, a rhythm that beats louder than the pulse of life itself. And as the centuries passed, our ancestors learned this lesson the hardest way possible, through the endless cost of feud. Imagine two tribes, once neighbors, trading food, stories, and perhaps even spouses. A quarrel begins with an insult, a slight, or perhaps the theft of an animal. One man strikes another. The wounded kin demands revenge. Blood is spilled. The opposing side, bound by their own code of honor, cannot let the killing stand. And so, the cycle begins, an endless echo of vengeance spiraling outward, until it consumes not only the original offenders but entire generations. Feuds were rarely swift affairs. They lingered like smoke, poisoning every exchange between rival groups. Even years after the original injury, even after those who caused it had died, the memory of wrong lingered like a shadow. Children grew up being told not of peace but of old grudges. Boys were taught to sharpen their spears, not to reconcile. Girls were warned never to trust the sons of enemies. Hatred became inheritance. The cost of these feuds was staggering. Lives that might have been spent hunting, gathering, or raising families were instead consumed by raiding and watchfulness. Camps lived under constant fear, sleep broken by the threat of ambush. Men who might have shared knowledge of tracking or fire-making kept it locked within their tribe, fearful it might give advantage to rivals. What could have been cooperation hardened into suspicion. Humanity was caught in a trap of its own making. And yet, vengeance demanded loyalty. To refuse revenge was to dishonor your kin, to appear weak, to risk betrayal from within. So even when some longed to break the cycle, the tribe itself pulled them back in. A young hunter who wanted peace might be mocked, shamed, or even cast out for cowardice. Honor was not just a personal matter, it was collective, binding each individual to the blood debts of the group. The toll was not only physical but emotional. To live in a world of endless feud meant carrying fear like a second skin. Every face could be an enemy. Every stranger was dangerous. Even allies could be questioned. Suspicion became the atmosphere of life, leaving little room for trust, laughter, or curiosity. Children grew up learning not joy but wariness. It shaped the mind as much as it shaped the spear. Archaeological evidence hints at this grim reality. Burial sites show clusters of violent injuries, cracked skulls, shattered ribs, spear points lodged in bone. Some bodies reveal lives cut short in their teens or 20s, testimony to generations lost to cycles of revenge. Settlements abandoned suddenly suggest raids that wiped out entire families. These were not isolated events but patterns. Humanity's early history is scarred with the costs of feuding. And the cost was not only counted in blood. Feuds drained resources. Hunting parties traveled not for food but for retaliation. Crops and gathered stores were burned in raids, leaving survivors hungry and weak. The time spent sharpening weapons, guarding camps, and plotting revenge was time not spent building, discovering, or creating. Feuds stunted growth. They locked humanity into survival rather than expansion. But perhaps the greatest cost was spiritual. To live for vengeance was to live chained to the past. Every action was determined by an injury already suffered, by a wound already inflicted. The future became merely an extension of yesterday's pain. Forgiveness had not yet been named, but its absence was deeply felt. Without it, humanity was trapped in memory, unable to step beyond the prison of resentment. Picture a young boy watching his father prepare for a raid. He does not know the man who first caused the quarrel. He may not even know the story clearly. But he knows this: his father demands loyalty, and the tribe demands blood. So he sharpens his spear, not for his own grievance but for someone else's wound. His life is already chained to a history that is not his own. That is the cost of feud, the inheritance of hatred. Feuds could last generations. Some were never resolved at all. Instead, they faded only when entire lineages disappeared, their memory swallowed by time. But before they ended, they consumed countless lives, leaving bones scattered across valleys and stories of sorrow whispered by survivors. For every act of vengeance that seemed to restore balance, another injury was created, another debt demanded. The cycle was endless, and the cost immeasurable. This was the paradox. Vengeance promised justice but delivered only more loss. It claimed to protect the tribe but often left it weaker. It claimed to preserve honor but frequently erased futures. And yet, in the absence of any other system, our ancestors clung to it. Better endless feud, they thought, than dishonor. Better vengeance than shame. But the cracks were already beginning to show. Tribes weakened by feud became vulnerable to hunger, disease, and rival groups who had found ways to live with less conflict. Slowly, painfully, humanity began to sense that vengeance alone was not enough, that some other path was needed, not to erase memory but to survive it. Forgiveness was still a whisper, not a word, but the cost of endless feud was making it harder and harder to ignore. And so, the story of vengeance is not only a story of violence. It is also the story of humanity reaching a breaking point. For only when the cost becomes unbearable does change become possible. And only when the cycle threatens to destroy everything do people begin to imagine something beyond it. The law of retaliation had brought humanity this far. But in its shadows, a new law was waiting, one not of endless debt, but of release. Forgiveness had not yet arrived, but the world was already preparing for it. Before humanity could name forgiveness, it dreamed of cleansing. Long before laws, treaties, or written words, the first healers and shamans emerged, not only to tend wounds of the flesh but to soothe wounds of the spirit. For in the world of endless feud and vengeance, guilt and fear lingered like invisible shadows. And someone had to face them. Someone had to speak to the unseen. Imagine a circle of firelight at the edge of night. The tribe gathers, silent, expectant. At the center stands the shaman, painted in ash and ochre, feathers trembling in the smoke. His role is not only healer of bodies but keeper of balance, mediator between the living and the spirits, between wrong and right, between guilt and release. When blood has been spilled, when hatred poisons the air, it is to him, or her, that the tribe turns. The shaman does not erase the wrong. He cannot bring back the dead, nor undo the insult. But through ritual, through chant, through trance, he transforms raw injury into something bearable, something the tribe can carry without being destroyed by it. He becomes a vessel for what forgiveness will one day become, a way to live with what has happened without being forever chained to it. Across the world, in countless early cultures, rituals of cleansing appear, water poured over the hands of the guilty, smoke rising from burning herbs carrying prayers upward, offerings laid at the feet of ancestors, songs repeated until memory itself begins to blur. These were not yet forgiveness in the modern sense, but they carried the same heartbeat, the longing to release, to move forward, to let go of the poison that vengeance alone could not cure. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies have found striking similarities in these rituals. A wrongdoer might be brought before the group, where the shaman speaks on his behalf, not excusing, but transforming. The guilt is lifted from the individual and placed into the ritual itself, into the smoke, the chant, the offering. In this way, the tribe symbolically cleanses the offense. The man may still carry scars, but he does not carry them alone. The community helps him shed their weight. Why was this necessary? Because vengeance is heavy, not only for the victim but for the avenger. To kill in return may satisfy honor, but it leaves an echo, an unease, a trembling in the soul. The shaman's work was to catch that echo and quiet it, to remind the tribe that there was more to life than the cycle of blood, to restore, if only briefly, the fragile balance between survival and destruction. Some rituals even mirrored death itself. The guilty might be symbolically buried, covered in earth or wrapped in skins, only to be reborn through chanting and cleansing. In this act, the tribe reenacted transformation. The past self, stained by wrong, is gone. The new self emerges, free to walk among them again. Such ceremonies carried immense psychological power. They gave the community a way to draw a line, to declare, the debt is settled, the balance restored. For early humans, spirits and ancestors were ever present. They watched, they judged, they intervened. Wrongs were not only offenses against people but against the invisible order of the world. To harm another was to anger the spirits. To cleanse a wrong, one had to appease them. Shamans became the interpreters of this unseen justice. Their chants were not just for the tribe but for the cosmos. They were humanity's first negotiators with the infinite. Picture a young woman accused of stealing food during a famine. The tribe is furious. The survival of all depends on fairness. In vengeance alone, she might be cast out, or worse. But the shaman steps in. He leads her through a ritual of confession, her hands washed in water, her face painted with ash. An offering is made, berries, herbs, perhaps even her own labor dedicated to the tribe. Slowly, the anger softens. The wrong is acknowledged, but so is her humanity. The community moves forward, scarred but intact. Such rituals reveal something profound. Forgiveness did not appear suddenly, as an invention out of nowhere. It gestated in the realm of ritual and spirit. Long before the word existed, the practice was lived. To cleanse, to release, to begin again. These were the first whispers of what would one day be called forgiveness. But rituals were not always gentle. Sometimes they demanded sacrifice, suffering, even pain. A wrongdoer might fast, bleed, or endure trials to prove sincerity. The path to cleansing was rarely easy, for early humans knew that to pretend a wound was healed when it was not was to invite worse damage later. Ritual forgiveness was hard-won, carved out of suffering and struggle. And yet, it worked. Archaeological traces show communities that endured despite conflict, groups that found ways to remain cohesive even in hardship. Without rituals of cleansing, every injury might have shattered them. The shaman's chants, the smoke of herbs, the symbolic rebirths, these were threads that stitched humanity together long enough for survival to continue. Over time, these practices became traditions. Stories of spirits demanding offerings turned into moral codes. Ancestors became guardians of fairness. Ritual cleansing evolved into structured justice. And woven into it all, faint but persistent, was the idea that not every wrong had to end in vengeance. Some wrongs could be released. Some debts could be transformed, not by blood, but by ritual. In these ceremonies, we see the first sketches of forgiveness, not the abstract philosophical concept it would later become, but the lived, embodied practice of release. The shaman was the midwife of this practice, guiding humanity toward a future in which letting go would matter as much as striking back. The fire dies low. The ritual ends. The tribe breathes easier, the wrong washed into smoke and silence. For now, balance is restored. For now, the burden is lighter. And though no one yet speaks the word forgiveness, its spirit hovers in the night air, carried on the embers, waiting for the day humanity will finally give it a name. Forgiveness did not arrive as a thunderclap. It did not descend all at once, fully formed, like a law etched in stone. Instead, it sprouted slowly, like a hidden seed pushing through the soil. And its first blossoms were not in ceremonies or cosmic rituals, but in the quiet, intimate moments of daily life. Imagine a small hunter-gatherer band moving across the plains. Their survival depends on cooperation, sharing meat, defending the weak, tending fires. But in this fragile balance, conflicts are inevitable. A man hoards more than his share of food. A child accidentally ruins a tool. A woman speaks harshly in anger. Each of these moments could spark resentment, even fracture the group. Yet somehow, many did not. Somehow, they found ways to soften the edges. This was where the first seeds of mercy took root, not in grand gestures, but in the pauses between retaliation. The choice not to strike, not to banish, not to escalate. A sigh instead of a blow. A warning instead of an exile. A hand extended, not withdrawn. These small acts carried immense weight, for they meant the difference between survival and disintegration. Mercy, in these earliest forms, was practical as much as it was emotional. To forgive was not yet a virtue, it was a necessity. Bands that could temper their conflicts with restraint lived longer, hunted better, endured hardship more easily. Groups that fractured at every insult vanished into history. Evolution favored those who, even unconsciously, practiced the art of letting go. Picture a young boy who spills water from a precious skin, wasting what little the group has carried through a long, dry season. The elder whose skin it was has every right to punish him, to rage, even to strike. But instead, she sighs, places a hand on his shoulder, and teaches him how to tie the knot tighter next time. The water is lost, but the boy is not. The group remains whole. That small choice is mercy. That moment, though unrecorded, is a seed of forgiveness. Such seeds sprouted everywhere humans live. Around the fires at night, where teasing replaced anger. During hunts, where mistakes were corrected with teaching, not banishment. In the rhythms of work, where the strong helped the weak without demanding repayment. These choices may not have been called forgiveness, but their essence was the same: to allow another to remain within the circle despite their flaw. Over generations, these seeds accumulated. They became woven into the fabric of human expectation. To forgive was not yet celebrated, but it was lived. Children learned it by watching elders restrain their tempers. Adults practiced it when they placed cooperation above pride. Slowly, almost invisibly, mercy moved from being a rare exception to a quiet rule. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer groups note that many have norms against prolonged grudges. Anger is often expressed quickly, then released. Long-term resentment is discouraged, for it poisons the group's cohesion. This may echo patterns deep in our past. The survival of the group required a kind of amnesia, a willingness to let small wrongs fade rather than calcify into endless feuds. And yet, this was not forgiveness as we know it today. It was not abstract or moralized. It was practical, embodied, immediate. You forgave because tomorrow you still needed your neighbor to share in the hunt. You let go because holding on would cost more than it was worth. The philosophy of forgiveness lay far in the future, but the habit of mercy was already being rehearsed in the mundane dramas of daily life. There is something profoundly human in these first seeds. They remind us that forgiveness is not only about gods and rituals, not only about laws and philosophy. It is also about spilled water, harsh words, clumsy mistakes, moments that could divide but do not. Forgiveness begins not in temples or courts, but in kitchens, camps, and doorways, the ordinary places where people decide again and again whether to keep others close or push them away. Consider the role of laughter. Early humans often diffused tension through humor. Teasing could replace punishment, turning error into story, embarrassment into bonding. The man who tripped during a hunt might be mocked around the fire, but the mockery carried a gift. It transformed shame into shared laughter. The wrong was remembered, but softened, its sharp edges blunted. This, too, was a seed of forgiveness, disguised as a joke. Mercy also grew through memory, or rather, through forgetting. Early groups may have recognized that holding every mistake in mind was dangerous. Better to let some fade. Better to focus on tomorrow's hunt, not yesterday's insult. Forgetting became a kind of forgiveness, a way of clearing space for the future. Still, these seeds were fragile. Mercy was always balanced against survival. A serious betrayal, a theft during famine, a deliberate attack, could still end in exile or death. Forgiveness was not guaranteed. It was conditional, fragile, tested by circumstance. And yet, the fact that it existed at all, that humans could choose mercy even some of the time, was revolutionary. No other animal seems to do it in quite the same way. These first seeds of forgiveness transformed human relationships. They allowed bonds to deepen, trust to grow, communities to endure. They turned the human group into more than just a survival machine. They turned it into a web of belonging, where love and loyalty could flourish. Without forgiveness in daily life, intimacy would have been impossible. Every wrong would have driven a wedge too deep to heal. But with it, families, friendships, and partnerships could last. As the centuries passed, these small mercies laid the foundation for something larger. They prepared the soil in which forgiveness as an idea could take root. When shamans later transformed wrongs through ritual, they were building on habits already lived in campfires and fields. When laws and philosophies would later extol forgiveness, they were naming something humanity had already practiced in silence. The seeds of mercy were planted in ordinary days, in the spilled water, the misplaced tool, the harsh word forgiven, the mistake turned into laughter. These were the first gardens of forgiveness, tended not by priests or kings, but by mothers, fathers, children, and neighbors. And from these gardens, something extraordinary would one day bloom, a vision of forgiveness not as a survival tactic, but as a moral power, a path to peace, a transformation of the human spirit. For now, though, the seeds lie low, hidden in the soil of daily life. They are not yet named. They are not yet exalted, but they are alive, quietly reshaping humanity, one merciful choice at a time. For much of human history, vengeance was the default response to harm. To be wronged meant to strike back. To be injured meant to restore balance with equal or greater force. The cycle of retaliation was seen as natural, even necessary. Without it, one risked humiliation, weakness, or the loss of standing within the group. Vengeance was protection, justice, deterrence, all wrapped into one. But even as vengeance ruled, cracks began to show. Its limits were etched into the fabric of human survival. The more vengeance was practiced, the more its consequences revealed themselves: families torn apart, resources wasted, alliances shattered. Retribution meant to heal the wound of injustice often deepened it. Picture a small clan in a valley. A theft occurs, perhaps a few strips of dried meat stolen by a hungry neighbor. The victim's family demands repayment. Anger swells. A blow is struck. Soon the theft becomes a feud, the feud a battle, and what began with a handful of meat ends with blood spilled, children orphaned, and hunters dead. The balance sought through vengeance collapses into chaos. In trying to restore honor, the group destroys itself. This was the terrible paradox of vengeance. It satisfied the immediate hunger for justice, but it starved the long-term needs of survival. A group caught in endless cycles of revenge could not last. Rivalries festered, hunts failed, and enemies multiplied. Every life taken in retaliation removed a hunter, a gatherer, a protector, weakening the group from within. Across the prehistoric world, humans must have confronted this dilemma again and again. They could not abandon vengeance entirely. It was too deeply tied to honor, deterrence, and emotional release. But neither could they indulge it without end, for unchecked vengeance threatened the very survival of the community. Slowly, painfully, humans discovered the limits of retribution. Anthropologists studying tribal societies today often note how feuds escalate. A single insult or injury spirals into generations of hostility, each act answered with another. And yet, many of these same societies developed mechanisms to stop the cycle: mediation, negotiation, even ritualized compensation. These mechanisms were not born from idealism but from necessity. At some point, people saw that vengeance could not be allowed to run forever. Something else had to intervene. Imagine the weariness of a community living in the shadow of revenge. Every insult carries the weight of future blood. Every child grows up knowing they may be asked to avenge their father's wound or their brother's death. The horizon of life is clouded with endless obligations to retaliate. How heavy that must have felt. How exhausting. At times, the weight itself became unbearable. Groups could not hunt together because suspicion lingered. Families lived in fear. The landscape was scarred not only by famine or predators but by human grudges that never died. And so, the need arose for something beyond vengeance. Not to erase it entirely, but to contain it, to put a limit on its destructive spiral. Perhaps the first limits came through negotiation between groups. Leaders realized that endless bloodshed left everyone weaker. They began to accept gifts or compensation or symbolic gestures in place of yet another death. A rival might offer cattle or tools or even a daughter in marriage to heal the wound of a killing. These were not acts of forgiveness in the modern sense, but they were steps toward something different. They acknowledged that vengeance had a cost too high to pay forever. Other limits arose within families themselves. A mother might beg her son not to avenge his brother, knowing it would only lead to her losing another child. An elder might forbid retaliation, not out of softness, but out of calculation. The clan needed every hunter alive. These decisions planted the idea that vengeance was not absolute, that it could be restrained, redirected, even denied. And yet, restraint was not easy. Anger demands satisfaction. The injured heart cries out for balance. To let a wrong go unanswered felt to early humans like a betrayal of honor itself. That is why the limits of vengeance did not emerge as lofty ideals but as hard-earned lessons. They were carved into human memory by the ruins vengeance left behind. Consider the cost of vendettas that consumed whole generations. In some tribal societies, anthropologists have recorded cycles of revenge that lasted decades, even centuries. Entire family lines devoted to killing one another over an ancient wrong. Imagine the toll. Children growing up without fathers, women widowed again and again, food wasted on conflict instead of survival. Vengeance promised dignity, but it delivered ruin. The limits of vengeance, then, were not just social but evolutionary. Groups that could not temper their blood feuds were weakened and displaced by those who could. Survival favored communities that found ways to stop the cycle. Perhaps this is why, across so many cultures, we see the rise of reconciliation, rituals of mediators, of symbolic gestures that cool the fires of revenge. These limits did not erase vengeance, they merely contained it. Humans still felt the pull of retaliation, but they began to recognize its dangers. In that recognition lay the first step toward forgiveness. Before humans could imagine mercy as an ideal, they had to see vengeance for what it was, a fire that, left unchecked, consumes everything. And so, vengeance met its limits. It did not vanish, but it bent. It yielded to practicality, to exhaustion, to the higher demands of survival. In the ashes of ruined families, in the silence of fields where hunters once stood, humanity began to glimpse another possibility, that to live, to endure, they needed something stronger than revenge. They needed a way to end the cycle without another death. That possibility was not yet named forgiveness. It was still fragile, uncertain, inconsistent. But it was alive. Every time a feud was cut short, every time bloodshed was traded for compensation, every time a wrong went unanswered for the sake of peace, humanity inched closer to the invention of forgiveness. The story of forgiveness, then, is also the story of vengeance. They are twin shadows locked in a long struggle. Forgiveness could only emerge once vengeance revealed its limits. And it was in those limits, in the weariness of endless retaliation, that mercy found its first foothold. In the long shadow of vengeance, humanity stumbled toward something new. It did not appear suddenly as a revelation, but slowly, like a faint trail beaten into the grass by many hesitant feet. Before forgiveness could exist, there had to be compromise, an agreement, however fragile, that blood could sometimes be answered with something other than blood. The first compromises were not born out of virtue. They were born out of necessity. The human story has always been tied to survival, and survival required choices that were not always satisfying to the heart. When hunters were killed, vengeance promised justice, but too much vengeance left the camp without hunters. When families were torn apart, anger promised honor, but too much anger left the hearths cold and empty. In this fragile balance, compromise began to take root. Picture two small clans who share the same valley. One day, in a quarrel over hunting rights, a man is killed. The dead man's family cries for blood, but both groups know the cost. They share the same watering hole, the same paths to the forest, the same precarious winter shelter. If they fall into a cycle of revenge, the valley itself may become uninhabitable. And so the leaders gather. They speak of restitution. Perhaps the killer's clan offers food or tools or shelter in exchange for peace. Perhaps a marriage is arranged, binding the two groups together so that killing one man does not destroy them both. Such exchanges may seem simple, even transactional, but in them lies something profound. They mark the moment when vengeance bends to something larger. The need for survival forces humans to accept that not every wound can be healed with blood. The first compromises may not have erased pain, but they allowed life to continue. And in the space where vengeance was restrained, the idea of forgiveness slowly prepared to grow. Archaeologists have found evidence of these early compromises in burial sites and cultural patterns. In some ancient graves, weapons are placed not beside the dead, but offered between groups, as though the exchange itself was meant to end a quarrel. In others, gifts of food or ornaments appear to mark the settling of disputes. These artifacts are silent, but they whisper a truth. Long before forgiveness was a word, humans found ways to soften vengeance with symbols of peace. The compromises were not always equal. Sometimes the stronger clan demanded little and gave less. Sometimes the weaker clan had to surrender daughters in marriage or offer tribute year after year to keep the peace. But even unequal compromise was different from endless revenge. It was a step, however painful, away from the abyss. And with each step, the human imagination expanded. People began to imagine a world where not every wrong must be repaid in kind, where loss could be honored not by another death, but by the building of ties that made further deaths less likely. These were fragile ideas, often resisted, often broken. But they were there. Like sparks struck in the darkness, they lit small corners of the human experience. The first compromises also revealed something about human emotion, that pain could be carried without always being acted upon. A father might still grieve the son who was killed, yet accept cattle in his place. A mother might still feel rage at her daughter's mistreatment, yet choose to preserve the clan's survival instead of demanding blood. Compromise required restraint, and restraint required a kind of inner strength different from violence. At the heart of these compromises was calculation, but also imagination. Humans had to imagine not just their own pain, but the future of their group. They had to weigh what was lost against what could still be saved. And in doing so, they planted the seeds of empathy, not yet the deep, transformative empathy of forgiveness, but the simple recognition that life must go on, and that to go on required peace. Of course, compromises were never perfect. Some were accepted grudgingly, with resentment simmering beneath the surface. Some collapsed, leading back into cycles of vengeance. Others hardened into traditions, formal systems of compensation, like the blood price or wergild, that later societies codified into law. What began as fragile, Improvised exchanges grew into institutions as communities realized they could not survive without rules that limited vengeance. But even in their imperfection, the first compromises mattered. They marked the slow evolution of human justice. They showed that humanity was not bound forever to the endless echo of revenge. There was another path, however narrow, however costly, however uncertain. Imagine the silence after such a compromise. The anger still lingers. The grief still burns. But there is no blood in the dirt, no child left fatherless that day. Instead, there is a feast, or a gift, or the joining of two families once divided. It is not forgiveness, not yet, but it is survival. And survival was always the first law of human life. Perhaps forgiveness was waiting inside those compromises all along, like a seed wrapped tightly in a husk. To compromise was to admit that vengeance was not always enough. And to admit that was to take the first step toward imagining something greater, not just peace, but mercy. In this way, the first compromises were humanity's quiet turning point. They did not abolish vengeance. They did not erase anger or grief. But they revealed, for the first time, that vengeance was not the only way forward. And in that revelation, the human story bent, ever so slightly, toward the possibility of forgiveness. Long before forgiveness had a name, it had a shape. And that shape was ritual. For our earliest ancestors, words alone were too fragile to carry the weight of grief, anger, and hope. Words could be denied, forgotten, twisted. But rituals, acts repeated with solemnity, charged with meaning, created something larger than speech. They carved memory into the bones of community. They gave invisible emotions a visible form. And through them, the first pathways toward reconciliation were laid. Across the ancient world, rituals emerged to mend wounds that vengeance could not heal. They were ceremonies of survival, born from the recognition that human beings needed more than simple transactions to restore balance. Gifts alone could feel cold, like a bargain struck without heart. A ritual, however, transformed the exchange into something sacred, something remembered. Imagine two clans gathered at the edge of a river. Tension still hangs in the air, a man has been killed, and blood cries out for blood. Yet instead of spears, both groups bring offerings. A fire is lit. The elders step forward, their voices carrying chants that have been spoken for generations. The killer's clan pours libations into the river, an offering to the spirits who watch from beyond. The family of the slain accepts, not because their grief has vanished, but because the ritual assures them that the community, the ancestors, and even the natural world have witnessed this act of reconciliation. In this way, rituals did more than calm anger. They bound people together in shared memory. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of such ceremonies in burial sites, cave paintings, and artifacts. In some regions, ochre-stained bones appear to have been carefully handled, suggesting collective rites performed to honor both the dead and the living. In others, symbolic items, broken weapons, scattered beads, shattered pots, seem to represent sacrifices made to close disputes. Even today, in indigenous traditions across Africa, Australia, and the Americas, echoes of these practices remain: feasts, dances, smoke rituals, songs of healing that weave fractured groups back together. But why rituals? Why not simply agree and move on? Because humans needed more than logic to transform vengeance into peace. Rituals allowed grief and anger to be acknowledged, not ignored. They created a liminal space, a time outside ordinary life, where emotions could be safely expressed and then gently transformed. The very structure of ritual, with its rhythms, its symbols, its careful order, helped soothe chaos and channel rage into meaning. Consider the role of fire. In countless cultures, fire became the centerpiece of reconciliation rituals. Flames consumed offerings, symbolically burning away the stain of conflict. Watching something tangible, meat, grain, wine, disappear into smoke gave people a sense that their own anger was being carried upward, released into the sky. What words could not do, flames accomplished through image. Or think of the role of touch. Handshakes, embraces, shared meals. These simple acts bridged divides in a way that agreements on their own never could. To eat from the same bowl, to drink from the same cup, was to acknowledge a new bond, to weave the fibers of community tighter than before. Rituals also offered something else: witnesses. Disputes settled in secret were fragile. A single spark could reignite the feud. But when reconciliation was performed in front of the entire community, with song, fire, and gift-giving, it gained the force of memory. Everyone present became a guardian of the peace. Breaking it was no longer a private matter but an offense against the whole group, and against the ancestors invoked in the ceremony. And so ritual became law before law was written. It became contract before contracts were carved in stone. It was theater, memory, and morality woven together. Yet rituals were not only communal, they were also profoundly emotional. For the grieving, the ritual provided a channel for pain. For the guilty, it offered a chance for atonement. And for the community, it offered reassurance that life could move forward, that the fragile web binding everyone together could hold. Picture again the riverbank ceremony. The family of the slain watches as their child's name is spoken, their life remembered. They watch as the killer's clan kneels, placing hands upon the earth in a gesture of humility. They hear chants rising into the night, chants that transform the unbearable weight of death into something the group can carry together. In that moment, forgiveness may not yet be felt, but the possibility of it begins to stir. These rituals remind us of something essential, that forgiveness, in its earliest forms, was not a solitary act. It was communal. It required witnesses, structure, and symbols larger than the individuals involved. Forgiveness was not simply given by one person to another, it was enacted through the whole group, as though humanity itself had to carry the burden together. Over time, these practices grew into institutions. In ancient Mesopotamia, ritualized oaths before gods bound conflicting parties. In early tribal Europe, feasts and processions accompanied peace treaties. In Africa, elaborate dances and storytelling served to mend divisions. And in each case, reconciliation was not a private matter, it was a sacred drama woven into the life of the tribe. What do these rituals tell us about the invention of forgiveness? That forgiveness was never just a feeling. It was always embodied, enacted, performed. To forgive was to create a memory strong enough to resist the pull of vengeance. And memory, in the ancient world, lived in ritual. So when we look back to those first ceremonies of reconciliation, we see more than quaint traditions. We see the birth of a new kind of human imagination, the ability to transform raw pain into shared meaning, and shared meaning into peace. The fire dies. The chants fade. The people return to their shelters, carrying with them the weight of both loss and hope. They do not call it forgiveness, not yet, but they know that something sacred has happened, something that allows them to face each other again, to share water, to share food, to share the valley they must all survive in together. And in that fragile, flickering moment, forgiveness takes one step closer to being born. Forgiveness may have begun as ritual, but mercy was something even more fragile. Mercy was not a chant or an offering, not a feast or a fire. Mercy was a decision, a trembling, deeply human choice. And unlike ritual, it could not be forced by elders nor secured by witnesses. Mercy lived within the heart of an individual, an invisible gesture that could change the course of life and death. In the prehistoric world, mercy was rare. Survival was sharp-edged. Resources were limited, dangers unending. To show weakness could invite ruin. And yet, against the grain of instinct, moments of mercy appeared, a captured enemy released, a wrongdoer spared, a hungry stranger offered food even when food was scarce. These were choices that defied the cold arithmetic of survival. Where did this impulse come from? What compelled early humans, whose lives were dictated by necessity, to sometimes choose compassion over cruelty? Some anthropologists argue that mercy was rooted in kinship. To spare a rival, to allow their children to live, was not just kindness, it was strategy. Tomorrow, those spared lives could become allies, spouses, partners in trade. Others suggest mercy emerged from empathy, that uniquely human ability to imagine another's suffering as one's own, to see fear in another's eyes and recognize it not as weakness but as a mirror. Perhaps both are true. Mercy may have been both survival and transcendence, a calculation wrapped in something greater, the recognition of shared humanity. Consider the story told by bones. Archaeologists have discovered skeletons tens of thousands of years old showing signs of severe injury, broken spines, shattered legs, crushed skulls, that had healed. In a world without hospitals, medicine, or advanced tools, these people survived only because their communities cared for them. Mercy kept them alive. Food was given to mouths that could not gather it. Shelter was provided to bodies that could not build it. Time and effort were spent on those who could give nothing in return. This too was mercy. And in such acts, we see its quiet power. For mercy did not only save lives, it strengthened the group itself. To show compassion was to create loyalty, to forge bonds deeper than fear. A tribe that carried its weak and wounded together was a tribe that endured. But mercy also created something far more profound, the seed of moral imagination. For the first time, humans learned they could choose not to punish, not to retaliate, not to let vengeance dictate every decision. In sparing another, they glimpsed the possibility of a world where power was not always cruel, where strength could bend toward kindness. Mercy was dangerous, yes. To spare an enemy might allow them to return stronger. To carry the weak might burden the group. But it was also a risk that unlocked something transcendent. Mercy showed that survival was not the only goal of human life. There was something else, something unmeasurable, that mattered too. Imagine two hunters in conflict. One has wronged the other, taken food from his traps. Caught in the act, the thief is brought before the group. Spears could end his life. And yet, the hunter lowers his weapon. Instead of death, he offers warning. Instead of vengeance, he chooses restraint. In that moment, the hunter creates a story, one that others will remember. A story where mercy becomes more than survival, it becomes honor. Honor is an important word here. For many early cultures, mercy was not seen as weakness but as strength. The strong could afford to be merciful. The powerful could afford to spare. And so mercy became both a moral choice and a social signal. To show mercy was to prove mastery, not just of others, but of oneself. As rituals gave forgiveness a communal stage, mercy gave it a personal soul. And together, they reshaped the human story. What does it mean to be merciful? To look at someone who has wronged you, who has caused harm, who might even threaten your survival, and to say, I will not destroy you. Mercy is, at its core, the refusal to become a mirror of cruelty. It is the interruption of violence, the creation of a pause where vengeance expected only continuation. Mercy, then, is not natural in the sense of instinct. Instinct demands retaliation, demands balance through blood. Mercy is something else. It is a conscious act, a decision to rise above instinct and carve a different path. And in that sense, it is profoundly human, perhaps one of the first sparks of morality itself. Across cultures, mercy would later take many forms. In the epics of Mesopotamia, in the laws of Hammurabi, in the codes of tribal Africa and indigenous America, rulers and elders sometimes tempered justice with clemency. In myths and legends, heroes often showed greatness not only in victory but in the sparing of enemies. And in religions, mercy became a central attribute of gods themselves, a divine quality mirrored in human life. But all of this grandeur traces back to those earliest, fragile acts: a wounded hunter carried instead of abandoned, a thief warned instead of killed, an enemy spared instead of struck down. In each case, the same question was whispered into the world: what if survival could be chosen together instead of apart? What if life could be preserved, not just ended? Mercy may have been rare, but when it appeared, it shifted the course of human imagination. It planted the idea that power did not have to mean domination, that strength could be expressed in restraint. And in that quiet revolution, forgiveness began to find its truest form, not just ritualized, not just communal, but deeply personal. Think again of the hunter sparing the thief, or the tribe carrying the crippled elder. These were not just isolated acts. They were sparks in the dark, moments when humanity glimpsed itself differently. When cruelty was expected, compassion appeared. And slowly, across generations, such acts accumulated into memory, into myth, into morality. That is the birth of mercy, a choice trembling and uncertain, yet powerful enough to reshape human destiny. Mercy does not erase pain. It does not undo harm. But it interrupts the endless cycle of vengeance. It whispers into the harsh winds of survival: we can be more than this. We can be more than violence. We can be more than instinct. And in that whisper, humanity began to find its voice. Long before laws were written, before kings ruled, and before philosophers debated morality, the divine was already watching. For ancient humans, the world was alive with gods, spirits, and unseen forces. Every fire that roared, every river that swelled, every storm that tore through the night carried the breath of something greater. And in this vast web of powers, humans stood small, fragile, and guilty. Because guilt was not only against one another. Guilt was against the cosmos itself. To forget an offering, to break a taboo, to trespass against the sacred, these were not private failings but cosmic ruptures. The world was ordered by spirits, and every action could upset their balance. And so forgiveness and the gods became inseparable. If one sought forgiveness from another human, one also sought it from the invisible world beyond. The gods, after all, held the power to withhold rain, to curse the hunt, to bring sickness into the body of a child. Forgiveness was not only social survival, it was cosmic survival. Look at the earliest rituals of Mesopotamia. There, clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform detail prayers of repentance, laments whispered to the heavens. A king who failed his people would stand in the temple, confessing his failures before the god Shamash, begging not just for mercy but for the restoration of order. Forgiveness was not private. It was a transaction written into the sky. Or turn to ancient Egypt. The dead were judged not by their strength or wealth but by the weight of their hearts. In the hall of Mot, a soul was placed upon scales, weighed against a feather, the feather of truth, of justice, of balance. To live unjustly, to carry cruelty, was to walk with a heavy heart. And if the scales tipped, the devourer waited. Forgiveness here was not a ritual of words. It was the very measure of eternity. To live mercifully was to prepare for a judgment beyond death. Among the early Hebrews, forgiveness became not just ritual but covenant. Sin was not only a mistake, it was a breach of relationship with God. The sacrifices offered in the temple were not payments for wrongdoing but bridges back to the divine. The prophets would later speak of mercy over ritual, of a God who desired the softening of hearts more than burnt offerings. Forgiveness was no longer only about appeasing an angry sky. It became a dialogue between human weakness and divine compassion. In Vedic India, hymns were sung to the gods asking for pardon. The Rigveda speaks of Varuna, the guardian of cosmic order, who binds the guilty with ropes of sin. Yet even here there is appeal. Loose us from our sins as from a rope, O Varuna. Forgiveness was not only possible but desired by the gods themselves, as if mercy were written into the fabric of the universe. And in early Greece, where gods were as human as they were divine, forgiveness was often unpredictable. Zeus could be merciful or merciless. Athena could defend or destroy. But even here, myths whispered that restraint and compassion carried divine favor. When Achilles finally released his fury and returned Hector's body to Priam, it was not only a moment of human mercy, it was a story sanctified by the gods themselves, teaching that even rage must bend toward reconciliation. Why did gods and forgiveness become so deeply entangled? Because the human heart could not bear guilt alone. Wrongdoing carried a weight too great for fragile bodies and brief lives. People needed assurance that their failures were not final, that the universe itself allowed for repair. To imagine gods who could forgive was to imagine a cosmos that mirrored the deepest human hope, that life was not condemned to endless vengeance, that mercy was possible even from the highest powers. Forgiveness and the gods also created order. When forgiveness was divine, it was no longer arbitrary. It became part of the structure of reality. A king who wronged his people could not simply demand pardon. He had to humble himself before heaven. A warrior who killed unjustly was not only guilty before men but before spirits. The gods became guardians of morality, enforcers of balance, arbiters of mercy. Yet divine forgiveness was never free. It demanded something: sacrifices of animals, of grain, of incense, prayers and chants, pilgrimages and offerings. In this exchange, forgiveness was both gift and transaction, both mercy and economy. Humans gave, and gods restored. And yet, the deeper one looks, the more it seems that even the gods were transformed by forgiveness. In the myths of many cultures, deities themselves evolve. A wrathful god becomes merciful, a distant power becomes compassionate. Perhaps this reflects not only human imagination but a human longing, to believe that mercy was not only a fragile human invention but a law of the cosmos itself. Imagine an ancient worshipper standing before a temple flame, confessing words into the smoke. They have stolen or lied or killed. The community demands punishment, but the soul demands more. And so they turn upward, whispering to the unseen, "May you forgive me. May the world forgive me. May I forgive myself." That whisper carries across millennia. In churches, mosques, and temples, in chants and songs, in whispered prayers before sleep, humans continue to link forgiveness with the divine. For what greater assurance could there be than that mercy is not just human weakness but divine strength? Forgiveness in the hands of gods became larger than survival. It became eternal. It became the very shape of salvation. And yet, was it truly invented by the gods, or projected onto them by us? Did humans create merciful gods to reflect their growing practice of forgiveness? Or did belief in merciful gods shape humans into forgiving creatures? Perhaps the answer is both. A mirror turned endlessly, humanity and divinity reflecting each other, mercy echoing back and forth across the heavens and the earth. One thing is certain: without the gods, forgiveness would have remained fragile, private, uncertain. But tied to the divine, forgiveness gained permanence. It became not just a choice, not just a ritual, but a principle of existence, a cosmic truth that brokenness can be mended, that guilt can be released, that even the harshest world bends, sometimes, toward mercy. This is forgiveness and the gods, a story written in prayers and sacrifices, in myths and rituals, in whispered pleas to the sky. A story that gave humanity courage to believe that failure was not the end, and that mercy was more than a dream. War was the fire that shaped the ancient world. Villages rose and fell, empires expanded and crumbled, and rivers of blood carved the borders of human history. In war, vengeance was the first instinct. When one tribe raided another, stealing food or killing kin, retaliation was not a question, it was a duty. An eye for an eye, a life for a life. To do otherwise was to appear weak, to invite further attack. But even in the furnace of battle, the shadow of forgiveness flickered. It was faint, fragile, and rare, but it was there. And its presence changed everything. Take the ancient Near East, where kings led armies across deserts and valleys. Victory was not only about land but about honor. When enemies surrendered, the choice lay before the conqueror, massacre or mercy. Many chose slaughter, carving their vengeance into the annals of history. But some chose forgiveness, not from softness, but from strategy. To spare a conquered people was to bind them, to turn foes into subjects. Here, forgiveness was not sentiment but statecraft. Consider the story of Cyrus the Great, founder of the Persian Empire. When he entered Babylon in 539 BCE, he did not burn the city or enslave its people as so many conquerors had before. Instead, he proclaimed freedom for captives, restored temples, and declared peace. Was this forgiveness, or a brilliant calculation, knowing that mercy could build an empire where fear could only fracture it? Perhaps it was both, a merging of wisdom and compassion that shifted the politics of empire. In Greece, the theater of war was often brutal. City-states clashed with relentless ferocity, their soldiers bound by honor and vengeance. Yet even here, forgiveness was remembered. The Iliad is a tale drenched in rage, but its climax is not a battle, it is forgiveness. After Achilles desecrated Hector's body in rage, Priam, the grieving father, entered his tent. Kneeling, he begged for the body of his son. And in that moment, the unthinkable happened. Achilles wept. He returned the body. He gave mercy. Homer tells us that the gods themselves looked down and blessed this moment of forgiveness amid endless vengeance. In Rome, forgiveness and vengeance were woven into law and ritual. Captured enemies could be paraded in triumph, humiliated, and executed, or they could be spared, granted citizenship, even invited into Roman life. To forgive was to expand. To forgive was to Romanize. Mercy became a weapon as sharp as the sword, for it made the conquered not just subjects but Romans. Yet this forgiveness was never naive, it always carried the echo of power. Forgiveness was given not from weakness but from overwhelming strength. Beyond the great empires, in smaller tribal societies, vengeance was often more intimate. A raid meant lives lost, and blood demanded blood. But cycles of vengeance could destroy entire communities. And so some tribes developed rituals of peacemaking. Enemy clans might exchange gifts, intermarry, or perform ceremonies to bury the hatchet, literally. Forgiveness here was practical, a survival mechanism to break the endless spiral of war. One striking example comes from the Iroquois Confederacy, long after prehistory but carrying echoes of ancient practices. Known as the Great Law of Peace, it united warring tribes under a council of forgiveness and reconciliation. Blood feuds were resolved not through endless vengeance but through dialogue and ritual. Though this emerged centuries later, it reminds us that even in the most violent contexts, forgiveness was a seed planted deep in the soil of human conflict. Yet forgiveness in war was never simple. It was always contested, always dangerous. To forgive an enemy could unite kingdoms, or it could invite betrayal. The line between mercy and naivete was razor-thin. Ancient history is filled with stories of spared enemies who rose again, of traitors forgiven who later struck in the night. Perhaps this is why forgiveness in war was often framed as divine. If a general or king forgave, it was not only a human choice but a gesture sanctified by the gods. Mercy, then, was not weakness but divine strength. And yet, even where mercy was strategic, it carried echoes of something deeper. When Achilles wept with Priam, it was not strategy, it was humanity. When Cyrus freed captives, it was not only politics, it was vision. Forgiveness in war revealed the possibility that, even in humanity's darkest furnace, compassion could flicker and survive. Still, vengeance remained the louder voice. The Hebrew Bible records tales of conquest drenched in fire and blood. The Assyrians carved their triumphs into stone, boasting of cities burned, bodies impaled, entire peoples erased. To show mercy was the exception, not the rule. The world was brutal, and vengeance often seemed more natural than forgiveness. But it is precisely because forgiveness was rare that it mattered so much. Each act of mercy became a story retold for generations. Each act of forgiveness carved a different possibility into the human imagination. That Achilles could forgive. That Cyrus could spare. That Romans could turn enemies into allies. These moments became legends, reminders that vengeance was not the only path. And they raise a haunting question: was forgiveness in war truly forgiveness, or simply another face of power? Was mercy genuine, or was it always manipulation, strategy, calculation? Perhaps the answer lies in the tension between the two. For even if mercy served politics, it also revealed something fragile and real: the recognition that enemies, too, were human. In the ruins of ancient battlefields, archaeologists find broken weapons, scorched walls, and bones. But in the stories passed down, they also find another kind of relic: the memory of mercy. The father kneeling before the killer of his son. The king sparing a conquered city. The ritual burying of the hatchet. These fragments of forgiveness glimmer faintly amid the smoke of war, proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, the dream of mercy never fully died. Forgiveness in war was never perfect. It was messy, political, dangerous. But it was real, and it left a mark on human history as profound as any conquest. Because vengeance may win battles, but forgiveness has the power to end wars. Before there were laws, there was memory. Before there were courts, there were clans. And before there were judges, there was vengeance. For most of early human history, justice was personal. If you harmed me, I harmed you back. If you killed my brother, I killed yours. No one else needed to intervene. Justice was not written on stone tablets or spoken in courts. It was carved into bodies and remembered in blood. But vengeance carried a problem. It spiraled. One killing led to another, and another, until entire families or tribes could be wiped away in the cycle of retaliation. What began as a way to restore balance often created deeper imbalance. If vengeance was the oldest justice, forgiveness was its antidote. But forgiveness could not always be relied upon. And so something new began to emerge: systems of justice that tried to step between vengeance and mercy, between punishment and forgiveness. The birth of custom and mediation. The first justice systems were not laws in the modern sense but customs. In small tribal groups, disputes were often settled by elders. An injury might be repaid with goods rather than blood. A wrong might be balanced by a ritual of apology, a public act that restored harmony. Instead of endless cycles of vengeance, there was mediation. Here we see the faint beginnings of justice as a system, an attempt to standardize how conflicts ended, to remove the decision from the chaos of anger. The rise of written law. As human societies grew larger, so too did the need for codified rules. Villages became towns, towns became cities, and strangers lived side by side. In small bands, everyone knew each other, but in cities, people could no longer rely on kinship bonds alone. Strangers could cheat you, injure you, or kill you, and if justice was left to private vengeance, chaos would reign. Out of this need, the earliest written laws were born. One of the most famous examples is the Code of Hammurabi, inscribed in Babylon nearly 4,000 years ago. Etched into stone, its rules declared what was owed for theft, injury, or murder. It is here we find the principle of lex talionis, an eye for an eye. At first glance, this sounds harsh, but in reality, it was a radical step toward limiting vengeance. Instead of killing an entire family for one injury, the punishment was restricted: only an eye for an eye, only a tooth for a tooth. The law acted as a brake on the endless escalation of vengeance. Justice was no longer about what one family could exact on another, it was about what the community decided was fair. Hammurabi's stele declared, to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. Whether or not that promise was kept, the idea itself was revolutionary. Justice was moving from personal vendetta toward a shared system. Justice as cosmic balance. In Egypt, justice took on a more spiritual form, guided by the principle of Ma'at, truth, balance, and cosmic order. Wrongdoing was not simply a crime against another person but against harmony itself. Pharaohs and judges acted not just as rulers but as guardians of balance. To forgive or to punish was framed as restoring Ma'at. Justice was less about vengeance and more about aligning human behavior with the order of the cosmos. Here, forgiveness was woven into law as harmony restored, rather than punishment inflicted. Justice as renewal. In ancient Israel, the Hebrew Bible speaks of justice as both divine command and human responsibility. The laws of Moses included punishments, yes, but also provisions for forgiveness: jubilee years, when debts were forgiven, when land was returned, when balance was restored. Justice was not simply punishment. It was renewal. Forgiveness was institutionalized, not left to chance or whim. Justice as civic reason in Greece. Justice evolved again. The earliest city-states were plagued by blood feuds, but the rise of courts shifted justice from personal to civic. Citizens could appeal to judges or assemblies, where disputes were decided not by vengeance but by reasoned argument. The goddess Dike, representing justice, was often depicted holding scales, not a sword. Balance, not revenge, became the symbol. In Athens, juries of ordinary citizens could acquit or condemn. Forgiveness, too, became possible, not as a personal act but as a civic decision. Justice as power and mercy. Rome carried this further still. Roman law became one of history's most enduring legacies, with principles that echo even today. Property rights, contracts, and citizenship were all defined by law, not blood. Yet Rome also institutionalized clemency. The concept of clementia, mercy granted by the powerful, became a celebrated virtue of emperors. Forgiveness was no longer a fragile personal act. It was written into the theater of power, a tool of governance. Caesar himself was famed for granting clemency to defeated enemies, weaving forgiveness into the fabric of empire. Justice as compensation. But justice systems were never purely about law. They were also about philosophy, about how humans thought balance should be restored. Was justice retribution, making the wrongdoer suffer? Or was it restoration, healing the wound? In many tribal systems, forgiveness was the goal, not through sentiment, but through compensation. Among the Germanic tribes of Europe, the practice of wergild, man price, set a value on human life. If someone was killed, the killer's family could pay a set amount of wealth to the victim's kin. This transformed vengeance into transaction, turning blood into silver. It was not perfect. It did not erase grief, but it allowed forgiveness where otherwise there would be endless cycles of death. The balance of law and mercy. Justice systems, then, were born from a simple human need, to escape the trap of vengeance without abandoning the need for balance. Forgiveness, too, was reshaped. It was no longer only an act of the heart but sometimes an act of the law. Mercy could be codified, institutionalized, even mandated. And yet the tension remained. Could law ever truly replace forgiveness? Could courts and codes ever heal the wounds that vengeance once sought to avenge? Or did the rise of justice systems only move forgiveness one step further away from the individual, turning it into an abstraction, a rule, a ritual? Perhaps the truth is this: the birth of justice systems did not erase vengeance, nor did it erase forgiveness. Instead, it braided them together, creating a spectrum of possibilities between punishment and mercy. Every ancient law, every ritual, every judgment was a negotiation between these poles. The world had changed. Justice was no longer left to anger, nor to chance. It had been given structure, form, and voice. And within that structure, forgiveness, fragile, rare, but enduring, found a new place to live. Because if vengeance was the oldest law, forgiveness was the one that made laws human. Forgiveness did not only emerge from human survival. It was also whispered into existence by something larger, something sacred. For as long as humans have wondered why the sun rises, why storms strike, why death comes, they have also wondered what the unseen powers of the world demand from us. Across the ancient world, forgiveness was not merely an option. It was a commandment, a ritual, an offering to gods who shaped the destiny of men. In many early cultures, to forgive was not only to heal relationships with each other but to heal relationships with the divine. Wrongdoing was seen as pollution, a stain that offended not just the victim but the cosmic order itself. To forgive was to cleanse, to restore balance, to keep the unseen world from collapsing into chaos. Egypt, forgiveness as cosmic balance. Take the ancient Egyptians. Their universe revolved around Ma'at, the sacred principle of truth, balance, and order. Every action was measured against it. To betray trust, to commit violence, to lie, these were not just offenses against people but against the entire balance of the cosmos. Forgiveness, then, was woven into rituals of purification. The wrongdoer confessed. Offerings were made. Harmony was restored. And when death finally came, the soul faced the weighing of the heart against the feather of Ma'at. Only those whose hearts were light, free from the weight of unforgiven guilt, could pass into the eternal field of reeds. Forgiveness here was not simply human, it was eternal. Hebrew thought, forgiveness as covenant. The Hebrews carried this sacred logic forward. In the Hebrew Bible, sin was a rupture not only between individuals but between humanity and God. Forgiveness therefore became divine territory. Sacrifices were offered at the temple, the blood of animals spilled upon altars as symbolic cleansing. The Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, was established as a sacred cycle of forgiveness, a day when sins were confessed, prayers lifted, and guilt symbolically cast away. The ritual was not only about individuals, it was about an entire people standing together, seeking forgiveness from their God and offering forgiveness to one another. Forgiveness became more than survival, it became covenant. Mesopotamia, forgiveness as obedience to the gods in Mesopotamia. 2. Rituals of atonement carried divine weight. When kings committed offenses, they sought forgiveness not only from their people but from the gods who had given them authority. Rituals of purification, temple offerings, and acts of clemency all functioned as bridges between human failure and divine mercy. Forgiveness was framed as obedience to powers greater than oneself, a recognition that harmony was sustained not merely by law but by the unseen will of the cosmos. India, forgiveness as cosmic alignment. Across the Indus Valley and into early Vedic traditions, forgiveness appeared as a virtue tied to Ta, the cosmic order. The hymns of the Rig Veda celebrated forgiveness as a divine quality, a trait that aligned human beings with the eternal rhythms of the universe. To forgive was to echo the patience of the gods themselves. The Sanskrit word kam carried both meanings, patience and forgiveness. To forgive was to endure, to absorb, to release. Forgiveness became an act of cosmic alignment, a spiritual discipline that transcended human anger. China, forgiveness as harmony. Far to the east, early Chinese traditions carried forgiveness into the realm of family and harmony. In Confucian thought, forgiveness was not always explicitly commanded, but harmony was. Resentment poisoned families, clans, and states. Forgiveness, therefore, was a necessary tool to maintain filial piety and social balance. In Taoist traditions, the idea of yielding, of flowing like water, suggested that holding on to anger was a form of resistance against the natural order. To forgive was to return to the flow of the Tao. Greece, forgiveness as divine transformation. In early Greece, forgiveness took shape through the gods of Olympus and their myths of wrath and reconciliation. Zeus was known for thunderous vengeance but also for xenia, sacred hospitality, the forgiveness of strangers who had transgressed unknowingly. The myths of Orpheus and Eurydice, of Orestes pursued by the Furies, carried lessons about guilt and divine absolution. The very birth of the court system in Athens, as myth tells it, came when Athena persuaded the Furies to release Orestes from endless vengeance, transforming them from spirits of wrath into protectors of justice. Forgiveness became divine transformation. The power, and peril, of sacred forgiveness. The sacred roots of forgiveness often rested in ritual. To confess, to offer sacrifice, to kneel, to pray, these were not just gestures of repentance but symbolic bridges to forgiveness. Sacred space, sacred time, sacred words, all were necessary. Without ritual, forgiveness risked being fragile, temporary. With ritual, it was sealed, remembered, consecrated. But these sacred roots also carried danger. If forgiveness was bound to the divine, who controlled it? Priests, kings, shamans, those who claimed to speak for the gods often decided who could be forgiven and who could not. Forgiveness became a tool of power. To be cast out, unforgiven, meant not only social death but eternal damnation. To be absolved meant peace in this life and the next. Forgiveness, therefore, was both gift and weapon, an act of mercy, but also a tool of control. The human heart beneath the sacred. Yet even in these sacred systems, the human heart mattered. Rituals could only do so much without true contrition. Again and again, sacred texts insist that forgiveness must be genuine. In the Psalms, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. In Vedic hymns, the true offering was not fire or grain but sincerity. In Confucian writings, ritual without virtue was empty. The sacred root of forgiveness always led back, in the end, to the human heart. Forgiveness as revelation. And so forgiveness became something larger than survival, larger than law. It became cosmic. To forgive was to realign with truth, with harmony, with the divine. To forgive was to cleanse not only the self but the world. To forgive was to echo the gods. In every sacred tradition, forgiveness carried a double edge. It was mercy, but also command. It was healing, but also discipline. It was liberation, but also control. It told human beings, you are not alone in your anger. The cosmos demands release. The gods themselves forgive, and so must you. And perhaps that is why forgiveness endured. Because it was not only useful, it was holy. It was written into the stars, into the order of the universe, into the whispered prayers of every age. Forgiveness became more than an invention. It became a revelation. Forgiveness is often painted as a gentle thing, a soft voice, a hand extended, a moment of quiet mercy. But beneath its tenderness lies a truth far more unsettling, forgiveness has always been bound to power. To forgive is to decide. To withhold forgiveness is also to decide. And in that decision rests a weight that shapes entire lives, families, even kingdoms. Forgiveness has never been neutral. It has always been a negotiation between strength and weakness, dominance and submission, justice and mercy. Authority and forgiveness. Imagine a tribal elder seated at the center of a circle while two clans face one another. Blood has been spilled. Words have been shouted. Grief hangs in the air. The elder listens, nods, then speaks. With a single declaration, "You will forgive," and the feud will end. The balance of power is shifted. One family is released from vengeance. Another is asked to surrender its rage. Forgiveness here is not simply kindness. It is authority. Forgiveness as political power in kingdoms and empires. This authority grew sharper. Rulers discovered that forgiveness was not only a moral virtue but a political weapon. To punish harshly was to inspire fear, but to forgive strategically was to inspire loyalty. A king who pardoned an enemy could bind that enemy in gratitude, or in humiliation. Forgiveness became a tool of kingship, a way to demonstrate that power was not only the ability to destroy but the ability to release. Consider the Roman Empire. Its emperors often staged grand acts of clemency. Prisoners were paraded through the streets only to be pardoned in public displays of magnanimity. The message was clear: Rome was merciful because Rome was strong. Forgiveness in this context was not weakness. It was performance. To forgive publicly was to remind everyone who held the power to forgive at all. This same logic extended into medieval Europe. Monarchs granted pardons to criminals, often during festivals or religious celebrations. These acts of clemency reinforced the idea that kings ruled by divine right, that their mercy echoed the mercy of God. To forgive was not just governance, it was theater, a stage upon which rulers displayed their benevolence while tightening their grip on power. Religious institutions and control. Forgiveness was never reserved only for rulers. Religious authorities held it tightly as well. In the medieval Catholic Church, forgiveness became institutionalized through confession. A sinner knelt before a priest, admitted their wrongs, and received absolution. Here forgiveness was mediated by the Church, which alone held the keys to heaven and hell. To be forgiven was to be restored to God's grace. To be denied forgiveness was to risk eternal damnation. Once again, forgiveness revealed its double edge: mercy for the penitent, control for the institution. In Islamic traditions, forgiveness held similar weight. The Quran speaks often of God as merciful, yet forgiveness also served political purposes. Caliphs and sultans used pardons to display moral superiority, to bind enemies into alliances, or to legitimize their rule. Forgiveness here was framed as a reflection of divine compassion, but it also carried unmistakable political utility. The double edge of forgiveness. This entanglement of forgiveness and power raises a deeper question: does forgiveness liberate, or does it bind? For the one who forgives, it can be a release. But for the one who is forgiven, it can also feel like submission. To be forgiven is to stand beneath someone else's authority, to accept their judgment, to live under the weight of their mercy. Forgiveness, then, can heal, but it can also humiliate. Think of public pardons throughout history. A rebel leader kneels before the throne. The monarch announces, "You are forgiven." The hall erupts in applause. To the crowd, it is mercy. To the forgiven, it is also exposure. Their weakness has been displayed. Their future now depends on the ruler's favor. Forgiveness in this moment is both gift and chain. Even in personal relationships this dynamic plays out. When a friend says, "I forgive you," something shifts. The forgiver holds the higher ground, even if only briefly. Power tilts. Sometimes this tilt is healing. Sometimes it lingers like a shadow. Forgiveness, whether in the home or the empire, has always been entangled with hierarchy. Forgiveness as resistance, but power flows both ways. Forgiveness can also be an act of defiance. Enslaved peoples who forgave their oppressors undermined the very logic of oppression. Victims who refused vengeance claimed a power greater than retribution, the power of moral authority. History is filled with moments when forgiveness was not submission but resistance. Consider Nelson Mandela. After 27 years in prison, he emerged not with vengeance but with forgiveness. This act did not weaken him, it elevated him. By forgiving his captors, he seized the moral high ground and reshaped the future of South Africa. Forgiveness here was not compliance, it was revolution. Power, then, is not only about who forgives, but why. A ruler's forgiveness can entrench authority. A victim's forgiveness can dismantle it. The philosophical paradox: forgiveness is never empty. It always shifts the ground beneath it. Philosophers have wrestled with this tension for centuries. Nietzsche, for example, saw forgiveness as dangerous, a disguised form of resentment, a way for the powerless to assert superiority through moral judgment. To forgive, he argued, was not always noble. Sometimes it was a hidden weapon. Others, like Hannah Arendt, saw forgiveness as the opposite, a power that freed humanity from the endless chains of vengeance, the one act that could undo the past's grip on the future. Both were right. Forgiveness is both weapon and remedy. It binds and it liberates. It humiliates and it heals. Its relationship with power is inseparable. The modern theater of forgiveness in the modern world, the theater of forgiveness continues. Politicians stage apologies and pardons. Nations establish truth and reconciliation commissions. Presidents pardon criminals on national holidays. Corporations issue public statements of regret. Each act carries the same paradox: forgiveness as mercy, forgiveness as strategy, forgiveness as power. The enduring paradox, perhaps this is why forgiveness remains so complicated. It is never just personal. It is always relational, always political, always bound to questions of dominance and submission. To forgive is to reshape a balance of power, whether between lovers, rivals, tribes, or nations. And yet, even within this complexity, forgiveness retains its magic, because power does not have to corrupt it. Forgiveness can be weaponized, yes, but it can also transcend. In the hands of kings, it may bind. In the hands of prophets, it may liberate. In the hands of ordinary people, it may heal. Forgiveness and power have always walked together, sometimes as allies, sometimes as enemies, but never apart. What does it mean to forgive? Not in the rituals of kings or the politics of empires, but within the fragile boundaries of the human mind. Strip away the ceremonies, the thrones, the confessions, the divine invocations, and we are left with something quieter, something almost invisible, the psychology of release. At its core, forgiveness is not simply an act between two people. It is an internal shift, a movement inside the mind, often unseen, sometimes unexplainable, where pain is set down like a heavy stone carried too long. The inner battleground forgiveness may begin outwardly, with words, with gestures, but its true battleground is within. Psychologists have long studied this phenomenon. They describe forgiveness as a process, not a single moment. Anger and resentment arrive first, often justified, often consuming. The injured mind circles around its wound, replaying the offense again and again like fingers pressing against a bruise. To forgive is to interrupt this cycle, to break free from the replay. It is the decision, or sometimes the slow realization, that the past cannot be rewritten, but the future can still be shaped. This interruption brings something profound: release. To release is not to condone, not to excuse, not to erase. It is to loosen the grip that pain has on the present. The science of forgiveness. Neuroscientists have traced this shift in the brain. When resentment dominates, the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, fires relentlessly, bathing the body in stress hormones. The heart races. Muscles tighten. Sleep fractures. But when forgiveness enters, when release begins, these alarms quiet. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for reasoning and regulation, takes the lead. The body exhales. The mind softens. Forgiveness, then, is not just philosophy. It is physiology. A change you can measure in heartbeats, in cortisol levels, in patterns of brain waves. Studies show that those who practice forgiveness experience lower blood pressure, stronger immune systems, even longer lives. To forgive is not only to free another, it is to unshackle oneself. The resistance to release. And yet, forgiveness is not easy. The psyche resists release. Anger feels righteous. Pain feels protective. To hold on to resentment can feel safer than to let it go. After all, if I forgive, does that mean I risk being hurt again? If I release my anger, does it mean the harm was acceptable? The mind wrestles with these questions, torn between the desire for peace and the instinct for self-defense. This is why forgiveness often emerges slowly, like dawn spreading across a darkened sky. It cannot be forced. It cannot be demanded. Sometimes it arrives after years of silence. Sometimes it comes in a single moment of clarity. The psychology of release is not linear. It moves in spirals, circling wounds, revisiting them, loosening them bit by bit, until at last, the grip breaks. Why the mind seeks forgiveness? But why does the human mind even seek forgiveness? The answer lies in the architecture of memory. Humans are storytellers. Our brains are wired to weave meaning from events, to link cause and effect, to stitch moments into narratives. When betrayal, hurt, or violence interrupts this story, the psyche fractures. Forgiveness repairs it. To forgive is to rewrite the narrative, to place the wound in a larger frame, one in which suffering is not the end but a turning point. This act of narrative repair explains why forgiveness is often tied to growth. Survivors of trauma sometimes describe forgiveness as transformative. It allows them not to forget but to integrate, to reclaim authorship over their lives. In this way, forgiveness is not about erasing the past. It is about reclaiming the power to tell the story differently. When forgiveness isn't possible, of course, not all wounds are forgivable. Psychology acknowledges this. Some harms are so deep, so ongoing, that forgiveness may not be possible, or even desirable. In such cases, release takes a different shape. One can release the hold of hatred without reconciling, without condoning, without ever uttering the words "I forgive you." Forgiveness, in its psychological essence, is less about absolving the offender and more about liberating the self. Consider the countless people who have forgiven in silence, never informing their offenders, never seeking reconciliation. They forgave not to repair a relationship but to reclaim peace. They forgave to sleep again, to breathe again, to live again. The paradox of strength. But there is a paradox here. Release feels like letting go, and yet it is also an act of strength. The brain must override its deepest instincts for revenge, its primal circuitry wired for survival. To forgive is not to collapse. It is to climb. It is a higher-order decision demanding emotional regulation, empathy, and imagination. The forgiver imagines a different future, one not bound by rage. This is why forgiveness feels liberating. It opens a door the psyche had closed. Religious traditions have long recognized this, though they clothed it in spiritual language. Psychology strips it back to its essence. Release is healing because the mind cannot endure the weight of perpetual bitterness. Hatred is too heavy to carry forever. Eventually, the psyche seeks relief. Forgiveness is the mechanism of that relief. The moment of release, and when it happens, when release truly occurs, it feels unmistakable. Survivors describe it like a breath they didn't know they were holding. Like chains falling away. Like silence after endless noise. The wound remains, but the grip of the wound weakens. The past still lives, but it no longer rules. The hidden revolution. This is the psychology of release, a hidden revolution inside the mind. It does not erase the harm, but it reshapes the self. It restores agency where pain had stolen it. It returns energy once wasted on resentment. It grants space for joy to re-enter. And perhaps most importantly, forgiveness reconnects us. Human beings are social creatures. Our survival has always depended on cooperation, on bonds, on belonging. Resentment isolates. Forgiveness restores. The psychology of release, then, is not only about healing the individual. It is about repairing the invisible threads that bind us together. To forgive is to be human. To release is to live again. Forgiveness is a universal concept, yet it wears many faces. Across time and space, across continents and civilizations, human beings have discovered the need to release anger, to reconcile, to repair what has been broken. And yet, the ways in which forgiveness manifests are as diverse as humanity itself. Forgiveness on the steppes. In the vast steppes of Central Asia, nomadic tribes relied on strict codes of honor, yet they also cultivated mechanisms of reconciliation. Blood feuds could spiral endlessly, threatening the survival of entire clans. To mitigate this, councils of elders mediated disputes, often arranging marriages or exchanges of goods to restore harmony. Forgiveness here was practical, necessary for survival, but it was also sacred. It reinforced bonds, preserved alliances, and ensured that the tribe could endure beyond individual conflicts. Forgiveness as ceremony. Far to the south, in the indigenous cultures of the Americas, forgiveness was often intertwined with ritual and ceremony. Among the Pueblo peoples, acts of wrongdoing were addressed not only through restitution but through symbolic cleansing. Offerings, dances, and prayers were performed to restore balance, between individuals, between families, and between the human and spirit worlds. Forgiveness was thus not simply social, it was cosmic, connecting people to the rhythms of the earth and the unseen forces that governed it. Communal forgiveness in Africa. In Africa, many tribal societies embraced forgiveness as a communal necessity. The Gakaka courts of Rwanda, revived centuries later after the genocide, are a modern reflection of this ancient logic. In traditional contexts, elders mediated conflicts through dialogue, restitution, and ritual acknowledgement. The act of forgiving was deeply public, binding not only the individual but the community. To forgive was to weave social cohesion, to prevent cycles of retaliation that could fracture entire societies. Forgiveness was practical, moral, and political all at once. Forgiveness as philosophy. Across Asia, forgiveness was deeply philosophical. In India, Hindu and Buddhist traditions emphasized calm, patience and forgiveness as virtues essential to spiritual growth. The Bhagavad Gita teaches that one must act without attachment, releasing anger and resentment to align with Dharma, the cosmic law. Buddhism similarly elevates forgiveness as a path toward liberation. Holding grudges binds the mind, sustains suffering, and prevents enlightenment. In China, forgiveness was framed through social harmony. Confucian philosophy emphasized family duty and societal stability. Resentment or revenge within families disrupted the order of society. To forgive, then, was a moral imperative, ensuring the continuation of harmony, respect, and hierarchical balance. Taoist traditions complemented this, teaching that one should flow with life rather than cling to anger, echoing the principle that forgiveness is a return to natural equilibrium. Forgiveness as faith and law. In the Middle East, forgiveness intertwined with law and faith. In Islamic teachings, God is frequently described as Al-Ghafur, the oft-forgiving. Humans are encouraged to emulate this divine mercy. Forgiveness is both a spiritual act and a social ethic, shaping relationships within families, communities, and nations. Even when justice is sought through law, mercy remains a virtue. The Quran teaches that forgiving an offender can be greater than exacting punishment, offering peace to both heart and society. In Europe, forgiveness has historically oscillated between personal, religious, and state dimensions. Medieval Christian traditions emphasized confession, absolution, and penance. Forgiveness was mediated through clergy, binding the sinner not only to society but to God. Yet secular expressions of forgiveness emerged as well. In Viking societies, restitution, through payment or ritual, often replaced endless vengeance. Forgiveness, even here, was pragmatic, ensuring the survival and cohesion of communities. Forgiveness as equilibrium. Across Oceania, indigenous cultures cultivated forgiveness through ritualized reconciliation. Among the Maori of New Zealand, the concept of Utu balanced retribution and restoration. While initial harm required acknowledgement and sometimes compensation, forgiveness was an essential step toward restoring social and spiritual equilibrium. Ceremonies marked these transitions, transforming personal grievance into collective harmony. Forgiveness was never merely private, it was woven into the life of the tribe, the land, and the ancestors. A common thread, infinite expressions despite differences, a common thread runs through these cultures. Forgiveness is relational. It mediates conflicts, heals communities, and sustains social bonds. It is rarely an isolated act of kindness, it is a negotiation, a covenant, a bridge between harm and repair. Across continents, forgiveness addresses both individual suffering and collective stability. Yet forgiveness is also culturally inflected. What counts as pardon in one society may be incomprehensible in another. Some traditions emphasize ritual and restitution, others inner transformation. Some bind forgiveness to law or authority, others to spiritual discipline or moral insight. The forms differ, but the function remains strikingly similar: to prevent the destructive spiral of resentment, to restore harmony, to allow life to continue. The human truth. This diversity teaches us something essential about humanity. Forgiveness is not a simple virtue, nor a universal rule imposed externally, it is adaptive. It arises wherever human beings must live together, must navigate harm, must manage power, and must heal wounds that threaten both the individual and the community. It is at once practical and profound, social and spiritual, temporal and eternal. In every culture, forgiveness carries tension. It is vulnerable and powerful, freeing yet potentially subjugating. It mediates justice, restores order, and sometimes challenges authority. It requires courage, imagination, and empathy. Across continents, across millennia, human beings have wrestled with these paradoxes. Forgiveness, then, is not only a moral choice, it is a cultural invention, a survival strategy, a spiritual practice. Its expression varies, but its essence remains: the recognition that life is richer when resentment is not allowed to dominate, when the heart is freed, when society is restored, when relationships endure. The mosaic of forgiveness. In the grand panorama of human experience, forgiveness appears as both a constant and a mosaic, a single principle expressed in infinite forms. It binds people to people, humans to gods, generations to one another. Across cultures, across time, forgiveness has carried the weight of survival, the grace of mercy, and the courage of transformation. And in this vast shared human endeavor, we begin to understand its power. Forgiveness is not merely invented by individuals or decreed by rulers. It emerges wherever human beings face harm, and choose, despite everything, to release it. It is both human and universal, intimate and collective, fragile and eternal. Forgiveness crosses boundaries. It shapes civilizations. It defines what it means to be human. Forgiveness is not only a moment, it is a thread woven through time, stretching from the first human settlements to our modern cities, from whispered prayers in sacred temples to public acts of reconciliation on grand stages. It leaves traces in history, culture, philosophy, and the human heart. Its legacy is both tangible and invisible, shaping the world in ways subtle and profound. Forgiveness in law. We see its imprint in law. The codes of Hammurabi, the decrees of pharaohs, the statutes of kings and emperors, all attempted to balance justice with mercy. Forgiveness transformed from a private act into a public principle, an organizing force of society. Even as punishment was codified, mercy was enshrined, reminding humanity that law could be tempered by compassion. This duality persists today in modern justice systems, where judges weigh mitigation and intent alongside punishment. Forgiveness, once whispered between clans, now resides at the heart of legal philosophy. Forgiveness as spiritual legacy. Its legacy is also spiritual. Across religions and cultures, forgiveness has been elevated to divine principle. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, all place forgiveness at the center of moral life. To forgive is to emulate the gods, to participate in a cosmic order that values restoration over destruction. These spiritual teachings have endured for millennia, guiding human behavior across generations, offering a framework for both individual growth and societal harmony. Forgiveness in relationships. Forgiveness also shapes relationships, the smallest yet most vital units of human life. In families, in friendships, in communities, it allows bonds to persist beyond injury. When one person forgives another, it does more than release anger, it affirms trust, reinforces connection, and sustains cooperation. Across time, forgiveness has enabled societies to survive, to thrive, and to navigate the inevitable harms that arise from living together. Without it, cycles of resentment would fracture communities and leave generations burdened with inherited bitterness. Forgiveness in social progress. The legacy of forgiveness is evident in social progress. Truth and reconciliation commissions, post-conflict pardons, restorative justice practices, all echo ancient insights that societies function best when harm is acknowledged, when accountability is balanced with mercy, when victims and perpetrators are brought into dialogue. Forgiveness here is not sentimental. It is pragmatic, ethical, and transformative. It allows societies to move forward without erasing memory, to honor suffering without perpetuating cycles of vengeance. Forgiveness in thought and science. Philosophers and thinkers have long explored its significance. Aristotle, Augustine, and Kant all grappled with the tension between justice and mercy. Modern psychologists reveal that forgiveness promotes mental and physical health, reducing stress, lowering blood pressure, and fostering resilience. Neuroscience confirms that forgiving reshapes neural pathways, allowing the mind to release the hold of trauma. Across disciplines, forgiveness emerges as both ancient wisdom and contemporary necessity. Forgiveness in art. Its legacy is also artistic. Literature, music, poetry, and theater have long explored the complexities of forgiveness. Shakespeare's plays, from The Tempest to Measure for Measure, depict characters navigating revenge, guilt, and mercy. Epics from across the globe, the Indian Mahabharata, Persian Shahnameh, Greek tragedies, explore the transformative power of release. Even in modern storytelling, forgiveness remains a central theme, reflecting its enduring resonance with the human experience. Art, like ritual, preserves the memory and meaning of forgiveness, allowing it to transcend generations and cultures. The moral legacy of forgiveness. Forgiveness leaves a moral legacy as well. It challenges humans to confront their limitations, to exercise empathy, to recognize shared vulnerability. It reminds us that no society, no family, no individual can escape the inevitability of harm, yet every society, family, and individual can choose how to respond. The choice to forgive defines character, shapes culture, and directs the arc of history. Its moral resonance endures because it is both deeply personal and profoundly universal. Forgiveness as a force of history. Even in political upheaval and social strife, forgiveness has shaped outcomes. Leaders who forgive can unite, heal, and inspire. Communities that embrace forgiveness can reconcile divisions and rebuild trust. Historical examples abound. Post-apartheid South Africa, post-genocide Rwanda, post-conflict Northern Ireland, all demonstrate that forgiveness, whether individual or collective, carries transformative potential. Its legacy is not simply the absence of revenge, but the presence of a future shaped by mercy and understanding. Forgiveness as evolutionary advantage. Forgiveness is also evolutionary. Anthropologists suggest that humans survived and thrived not only through strength and intelligence but through the capacity to forgive. Social cohesion, cooperation, and reconciliation enabled early humans to navigate complex group dynamics, to maintain alliances, and to reduce destructive cycles of retaliation. Forgiveness is embedded in the architecture of human social life, as ancient as memory itself, as enduring as the instinct to belong. The paradox and the power. Its legacy is paradoxical. Forgiveness can be a weapon or a gift, a choice that liberates or a choice that binds. Yet history shows that when wielded with courage, it strengthens societies, nurtures empathy, and promotes resilience. When practiced sincerely, it transforms individuals, communities, and civilizations. Its paradox is its power, fragile yet enduring, personal yet universal, ethical yet practical. Forgiveness in the modern world. In our modern world, forgiveness continues to matter. It shapes diplomacy, conflict resolution, therapy, and personal relationships. It provides a counterbalance to vengeance, aggression, and polarization. In a society increasingly aware of injustice, the act of forgiveness challenges individuals to move beyond anger without forgetting, to seek reconciliation without compromising truth. Its legacy is a guide for navigating the ethical, emotional, and social complexities of contemporary life. The living inheritance. Ultimately, the legacy of forgiveness is a testament to human potential. It is evidence that, across time and space, human beings have recognized the destructive power of resentment and the creative power of release. It is proof that despite violence, cruelty, and betrayal, we possess the capacity to choose mercy, to restore balance, to weave connections anew. Forgiveness carries the memory of our ancestors' struggles, the wisdom of our cultures, and the hope for generations yet to come. Forgiveness is the invisible architecture of civilization. Its legacy is etched not in stone alone but in hearts, minds, and communities. It is a bridge from past to future, from harm to healing, from isolation to connection. Its echo reverberates in every act of reconciliation, every gesture of mercy, every decision to release anger rather than let it fester. And so the story of forgiveness is far from over. It began in the minds and hearts of our earliest ancestors, it flowed through cultures, rituals, and philosophies, and it continues to shape our lives today. Its legacy is both enduring and evolving, a testament to the human capacity to transform pain into growth, suffering into wisdom, and conflict into connection. Forgiveness is not a relic of the past. It is a living inheritance. It is the proof that humanity can choose again and again to rise above vengeance, to embrace empathy, and to create a world where release is possible and where healing endures. It is the greatest legacy we inherit, and the greatest gift we can pass on. Forgiveness is ancient, yet it is never static. In the modern world, it continues to evolve, taking forms our ancestors could scarcely imagine. It flows through our legal systems, our politics, our personal relationships, and even our digital lives. It is both timeless and timely, adapting to the complexities of contemporary existence. Forgiveness in modern law. In contemporary law, forgiveness is embedded in clemency, pardons, and restorative justice. Modern courts recognize that justice without mercy can fracture communities rather than heal them. Restorative practices bring victims and offenders into dialogue, creating opportunities for acknowledgement, accountability, and reconciliation. Forgiveness here is not optional. It is a deliberate tool for repairing social fabric, reducing recidivism, and fostering communal trust. Its ancient roots echo clearly. Forgiveness as both social glue and moral principle. Forgiveness in politics. Politics, too, is shaped by acts of forgiveness. Leaders who choose mercy can shift the arc of history. Post-apartheid South Africa, led by Nelson Mandela, remains the quintessential example. Mandela's decision to forgive his oppressors was not naive. It was a calculated act of moral and political courage, designed to unify a fractured nation. Forgiveness here is strategic and ethical, an instrument that restores trust and reshapes futures. Across nations, political forgiveness has the power to transform enmity into dialogue, resentment into cooperation, and past injustices into pathways toward collective healing. Forgiveness in personal life. In personal relationships, forgiveness remains deeply transformative. Modern psychology confirms that releasing anger and resentment promotes mental and physical health. Forgiveness reduces stress, fosters empathy, and strengthens emotional resilience. Therapists encourage clients to explore forgiveness not as an act of submission, but as a conscious choice to reclaim agency. The act of forgiving in contemporary life is often invisible yet potent, quietly reshaping minds, hearts, and intimate bonds. Forgiveness in the digital age. Technology and the digital age have added new dimensions. Social media amplifies grievances, allowing minor slights to escalate into public disputes. Forgiveness has become a conscious, sometimes radical act, to refrain from retaliation online, to release anger in a space designed for outrage, to humanize rather than vilify. The psychology of release is tested in new ways, demanding mindfulness, empathy, and deliberate restraint. To forgive in the digital world is to assert humanity against an environment that often rewards indignation and conflict. Forgiveness in education. Education increasingly emphasizes forgiveness as a life skill. Schools and universities teach conflict resolution, emotional intelligence, and restorative practices. These lessons are practical, preparing young people to navigate communities, workplaces, and relationships. They reinforce the idea that forgiveness is not weakness but wisdom, a tool for resilience, cooperation, and social harmony. Forgiveness in global crises. Forgiveness also intersects with global crises. In post-conflict societies, reconciliation programs aim to rebuild trust among communities devastated by war, genocide, or systemic oppression. Truth and reconciliation commissions, reparations programs, and dialogue initiatives rely on structured pathways to forgiveness. These acts are profoundly modern yet grounded in ancient impulses, the desire to repair, restore, and release. Forgiveness here becomes a mechanism for collective survival, healing, and peace. The challenges of modern forgiveness. Yet the modern world tests forgiveness as never before. Globalization exposes us to new injustices, often far from our immediate experience: systemic oppression, environmental destruction, political corruption, human rights abuses. To forgive in such contexts is complex. It requires discernment, recognizing that releasing anger does not mean condoning wrongdoing, and that accountability must coexist with mercy. Forgiveness becomes a moral practice, a way to navigate vast networks of harm while preserving integrity and agency. Philosophy, art, and science of forgiveness. Modern thinkers continue to probe forgiveness. Some argue it must be coupled with justice, that it cannot be abstract or sentimental. Others assert that forgiveness itself is revolutionary, capable of breaking cycles of vengeance and transforming social structures. Art and literature remain vital vessels for understanding forgiveness. Contemporary novels, films, and documentaries explore its messiness, partiality, and humanity, resonating because they reflect real struggles and triumphs. Science confirms what sages long intuited: forgiveness rewires the brain, reduces stress, and enhances resilience. Modern research translates ancient wisdom into practical tools for therapy, conflict resolution, and social cohesion. Forgiveness as a living force. Forgiveness in the modern world is multidimensional, personal and political, ethical and practical, psychological and spiritual. It persists as a bridge between past and future, allowing individuals and societies to move beyond harm. Its forms are new, its challenges unprecedented, yet its essence unchanged: the conscious decision to release anger, to restore connection, to create space for life beyond resentment. Ultimately, forgiveness in our time is a testament to human resilience. It shows that even in a world of unprecedented complexity and rapid change, the principles that sustained humanity across millennia still matter. It links our present to the past and points toward the future. It reminds us that the capacity to forgive is among the most profound expressions of human strength, wisdom, and hope. The enduring gift. Forgiveness in the modern world is not merely a relic of history or a personal virtue. It is a living, evolving force shaping relationships, societies, and the global conscience. Its presence confirms that humans across time and space retain the capacity to rise above harm, to transform suffering, and to create worlds of empathy, justice, and peace. In every act of modern forgiveness, public or private, we participate in a lineage stretching back to the first humans, across rituals, cultures, and civilizations. We inherit the wisdom of ancestors, the insights of thinkers, and the experiences of communities. Each choice to forgive continues the story, shaping the legacy of humanity itself. Forgiveness today, as in the ancient world, is both radical and essential. It releases the past, restores connection, and affirms the enduring potential of the human spirit. It is the bridge between what has been and what can be, a testament to the resilience, wisdom, and compassion that define our shared humanity.